Sometimes a man convinces himself he's too old for second chances, that his best years are behind him and all that's left is waiting. Jacob Stone had made peace with dying alone in the Colorado mountains after 20 years of solitude. Then one November morning, a young woman named Sarah Whitmore appeared at his cabin door through the falling snow. She'd traveled 300 miles on horseback just to find him. What she said next would change his life forever. She'd been waiting for him for 7 years. But what would make a woman search the wilderness for a weathered mountain man twice her age? What secret connected them across all those years and miles? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat at 9,000 feet, tucked into a hollow where the wind couldn't reach it but the sun could. Jacob Stone had built it with his own hands 20 years ago, when he'd first come to these mountains, running from a grief that threatened to swallow him whole. The logs were weathered silver grey now, chinked tight against the cold with moss and mud. A stone chimney rose from the center, sending up a thin ribbon of smoke most days. It wasn't much to look at, but it had kept him alive through 2 decades of winters that killed weaker men. He woke that November morning the way he always did, before dawn, when the world was still and quiet and belonged only to him. The cabin was cold enough that his breath misted in the darkness. He lay there for a moment under the heavy bearskin, listening. The wind had died during the night. That meant snow was coming. The heavy kind that turned the peaks into fortresses no man could cross until spring decided to loosen its grip. Jacob pushed himself up, feeling the familiar protest in his back and shoulders. 63 years old, and every one of them had left their mark. His feet found the cold floor, and he moved to the hearth, stirring the coals back to life. The kindling caught quickly. He never let a fire die completely. Not up here where cold could kill you before you realized you were in trouble. While the cabin warmed, he dressed in layers, wool long johns, canvas pants worn soft with age, a flannel shirt his wife had made him before she died, and a leather vest. His boots were moccasins he'd traded for, lined with rabbit fur. Quiet on the trap lines, warm enough for all but the worst days. He ran his fingers through his hair, silver now, past his shoulders because cutting it seemed like unnecessary effort, and tied it back with a leather cord. The mirror above his wash basin showed him the face he'd grown accustomed to, weathered brown skin, lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth, a beard that had gone from black to grey to pure white. His eyes were still clear, though, pale blue, like creek water. Margaret used to say they were the first thing she'd noticed about him. That was 40 years ago, when he'd been a young man working on her father's ranch in Montana, before the cavalry, before they'd married, before they'd lost everything. He pushed the memories away. That was the trick to surviving up here. You learned to lock the past in a room in your mind and only visited when you were strong enough to handle it. Most days, he wasn't. Jacob made coffee in a battered pot, the grounds reused until they gave up their last bit of flavor. He fried cornmeal mush in bacon grease and ate standing by the window, looking out at the mountains that had become his whole world. The peaks were already white with early season snow, sharp against the pre-dawn sky. Beautiful and deadly, like most things worth knowing. After breakfast, he gathered his gear for the trap line, a canvas pack, his knife, a hatchet, his rifle. The Winchester was older than his time in these mountains, but he kept it clean, and it had never failed him. Bear and mountain lions didn't care how old a man was. The rifle was the great equalizer. He stepped outside just as the sun broke over the eastern ridge. The cold hit him like a slap, sharp and clean. His breath plumed in front of him. The thermometer nailed to the cabin wall read 18 degrees, mild for November at this altitude. He'd seen it drop to 40 below, cold enough that trees exploded when their sap froze. The horses, 2 of them, a bay gelding named Sam and a paint mare called Birdie, nickered from the small corral. He'd built the shelter lean-to against the rock face, protected from the north wind. The animals had survived up here almost as long as he had. He fed them hay from his small store, checked their water. They'd need to make a trip down to Pine Ridge before the deep snows came. Supplies were running low: flour, salt, coffee. The things a man couldn't make or trap for himself. Jacob spent the morning running his trap line, a circuit that took him 3 hours through the timber and along the creek. He found 2 marten and a fox, all frozen solid in the traps. Good pelts. He'd get fair prices when he went down to trade. He reset the traps with practiced efficiency, his hands working even though they were numb with cold. This was the rhythm of his life: trap, check, skin, cure, trade. Day after day, season after season, year after year. By the time he returned to the cabin, it was past noon, and the sky had gone the flat grey-white that meant snow was close. He skinned the animals on the workbench behind the cabin, scraping the hides clean and stretching them on frames. The work was meditative, requiring attention but not thought. His mind could wander while his hands moved. He thought about Thomas Whitmore, which was unusual. He tried not to think about the people he'd left behind when he'd come to the mountains. Thomas had been barely 17 when Jacob had worked as foreman on the Walker Ranch in Wyoming. Eager kid, always trailing after Jacob, asking questions, wanting to learn everything about horses and cattle and the land. Jacob had been patient with him. The boy reminded him of the son he'd never had, might have had if his daughter had lived. If Margaret hadn't died of the same fever that took their baby girl, he'd left the ranch suddenly. The grief finally too much to carry around other people. He'd simply packed his gear one morning and ridden into the mountains, looking for a place remote enough that memory couldn't follow. Thomas had been devastated, Jacob had heard later, but he'd hardened his heart to it. Better for the boy to learn early that people leave, that you can't count on anyone staying. That was 17 years ago. Thomas would be in his mid-30s now if he'd lived. Probably had a family, a ranch of his own. Jacob hoped he'd done well. The boy had deserved better than to be abandoned by another person he'd trusted. Jacob finished with the hides as the first snow began to fall, big flakes drifting down soft and slow. He carried the frames inside to cure near the fire, then set about making an early supper. Beans and salt pork, the same meal he'd eaten 1,000 times. He'd just sat down to eat when he heard it, the sound of a horse moving through the snow outside. He froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. In 20 years, no one had come to his cabin uninvited. The few trappers and prospectors who worked this high country knew which valleys were his and stayed clear. Visitors meant trouble or tragedy, and he wanted no part of either. Jacob set down his bowl and picked up the rifle, checking the load by feel. He moved to the window and looked out through the gap between the shutters. A single rider was approaching through the falling snow, leading their horse rather than riding it. Smart. The trail up to his cabin was treacherous if you didn't know it. The figure was small, bundled in a heavy coat and hat. As they drew closer, Jacob realized with a start that it was a woman. His first thought was that she was lost, maybe separated from a party further down the mountain. His second thought was that she'd come a long way. The horse was exhausted, its head hanging low, its breath steaming in the cold air. The woman herself moved like someone at the end of their strength, each step deliberate and careful. Jacob watched her approach, his grip tightening on the rifle. She stopped 20 feet from the cabin, looking up at the structure with what seemed like relief. Then she called out, her voice clear despite the falling snow. "Mr. Stone." Jacob Stone. She knew his name. That changed everything. He moved to the door, keeping the rifle in his hand, but pointed at the ground. He opened it and stepped out onto the small porch he'd built to keep snow from drifting against the door. "I'm Stone," he said. His voice sounded rusty. He rarely spoke aloud up here. "Who's asking?" The woman pushed back her hat, and Jacob saw her face for the first time. Young, mid-20s at most, pretty in a practical way, with strong features and dark eyes that looked right at him without flinching. Her cheeks were red with cold, her lips chapped. She'd been traveling hard. "My name is Sarah Whitmore," she said. "Thomas Whitmore was my father." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Jacob felt something shift in his chest, a door he'd thought locked forever rattling on its hinges. Thomas. This was Thomas's daughter. He could see it now. She had her father's eyes, his determined jaw. "Thomas," Jacob said quietly. It wasn't a question, just the name hanging in the cold air between them. "Yes, sir." Sarah took a step closer, her horse following obediently. "He passed 7 years ago, riding accident. But before he died, he talked about you. He told me that if I ever needed help, if I ever needed to find someone who could teach me how to stand on my own, I should find Jacob Stone in the Colorado high country." Jacob's throat felt tight. 7 years. Thomas had been dead for 7 years, and he'd never known. The boy he'd mentored, the young man he'd left behind, gone. And this girl, this young woman, had spent years looking for him. "That's a long way to come," Jacob said finally. "And it's getting dark. There's weather moving in." "I know," Sarah said. "I've been riding for 2 weeks. I'm not going back down tonight." It wasn't a request. Jacob studied her for a long moment. She met his gaze steadily, and he saw something in her that reminded him of himself at that age, a kind of determined desperation, the look of someone who'd run out of other options. "You can stable your horse with mine," he said, making a decision he knew he'd probably regret. "We'll talk inside where it's warm." Relief flooded Sarah's face, though she tried to hide it. "Thank you." Jacob led her around to the corral, showing her where to put her horse and gear. The animal was a good one, a sturdy roan mare that had been well cared for despite the hard journey. While Sarah unsaddled, Jacob forked out hay and broke the ice on the water trough. They worked in silence, the snow falling heavier now, building up on their shoulders and hats. When they finally entered the cabin, Sarah stopped just inside the door and looked around. Jacob tried to see it through her eyes, small, dim, sparse. A single room with his bed in one corner, the table and chairs he'd made from lodgepole pine, shelves holding his few possessions, the hearth taking up most of one wall. Pelts and hides hung from the rafters, drying. It smelled like wood smoke, leather, and coffee. A hermit's den. "Sit," Jacob said, gesturing to the table. "You hungry?" "Starving," Sarah admitted. She removed her coat and hat, revealing a simple dress underneath, practical wool in dark blue. Her hair was brown, braided and pinned up. She sat at his table like she belonged there, which unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Jacob heated up the beans and pork, adding more to the pot. He sliced bread he'd baked 2 days ago, hard now but edible, when soaked in the bean juice. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set everything on the table. Sarah ate like she meant it, not dainty but not wasteful either. He found himself watching her hands, work roughened, capable. Her father's hands. "Tell me about Thomas," Jacob said when she'd taken the edge off her hunger. "How did it happen?" Sarah set down her spoon. "He was breaking a horse for a neighbor. 3-year-old stallion, mean-spirited. The horse threw him and he hit his head on a fence post. He lived for 2 days, mostly unconscious. But there were moments when he was clear. That's when he talked about you." Jacob felt the old guilt rise up, familiar as an ache in his bones. "I should have stayed, should have been there." "He never blamed you," Sarah said quickly. "He understood why you left. He told me about your wife, your daughter. He said you'd taught him that sometimes a man has to walk away from everything to save what's left of himself." The words hit harder than Jacob expected. He stood abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, the snow was falling in earnest now, already covering the ground in a thick blanket. "Why are you really here, Sarah?" he asked, his back to her. "Your father's been gone 7 years. Why now?" He heard her take a breath, gathering herself. "Because I'm running," she said simply. "And I don't have anywhere else to go." Jacob turned to face her. In the firelight, she looked younger and older at the same time. Young enough to have a whole life ahead of her, old enough to have already seen too much of the world's hardness. "Running from what?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. There were only so many things that sent young women into the mountains alone. "From a marriage I don't want," Sarah said, meeting his eyes. "From a man who thinks he owns me because his family paid my debts. From a life that would kill me slower than any winter could." Jacob looked at this young woman, Thomas's daughter, sitting at his table, asking for his help. Every instinct told him to say no, to send her back down the mountain in the morning, to preserve the solitude he'd built so carefully. He was too old, too set in his ways, too damaged to take responsibility for another human being. But there was another voice, quieter but insistent. The voice that remembered Thomas's eager face, the boy's loyalty and trust. The voice that knew what it meant to be desperate enough to ride 300 miles into the wilderness looking for hope. "You can stay until the snow melts," Jacob heard himself say. "That's 3, maybe 4 months. But when the pass is clear, you'll need to decide what comes next. I can't fix your life for you." Sarah's eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. "I don't need you to fix anything. I just need time to figure out how to fix it myself." "That's all I'm asking," Jacob nodded slowly. "Then we have an understanding." "Thank you," Sarah said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Jacob replied. "Winter up here is harder than you can imagine. You might regret this choice before spring comes." Sarah smiled, a small, determined expression that reminded him so much of her father, it hurt to look at. "I won't regret it," she said. "I've been waiting 7 years to find you, Mr. Stone. Whatever happens now, at least I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." Jacob didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He moved to the corner where he kept his spare blankets and began making up a pallet near the fire. Tomorrow, he'd figure out how to reconfigure the cabin for 2 people. Tonight, he'd give her the warmest spot and take the cold himself. It was the least he could do for Thomas's daughter. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and steady, sealing them into the high country until spring decided to let them go. Jacob Stone had thought his story was finished, that the only chapters left were waiting and eventually dying alone in these mountains. But as he looked at Sarah Whitmore curled up by his fire, already drifting into exhausted sleep, he felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years, a tiny, fragile flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't quite finished after all. Jacob woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment, still caught in the fog between sleep and waking, he thought he was back in Montana with Margaret. Then reality settled over him like cold water, and he remembered Sarah Whitmore was sleeping by his fire, or had been sleeping. The sounds coming from his kitchen area made it clear she was awake and cooking. He sat up on his bed, every joint protesting. He'd given Sarah the warm spot by the fire and taken his usual place in the corner. At his age, a cold night left him stiff until he got moving. He pulled on his boots and stood, running his hands through his hair. Sarah turned from the stove as he approached. She'd already dressed, her hair braided neatly. "Good morning," she said. "I hope you don't mind. I found the bacon and some eggs. Figured I should make myself useful." Jacob grunted, moving to the window. 2 feet of new snow had fallen overnight, maybe more. The world outside was white and silent, the kind of quiet that only came after a heavy snow. "They weren't going anywhere today." "You know how to cook," he observed, sitting at the table. "My father taught me everything he could before he died," Sarah said, bringing him a plate. "How to cook, hunt, track, read sign. He said a woman needed to know how to take care of herself because the world wasn't kind to those who couldn't." Jacob ate in silence, thinking about Thomas teaching his daughter the same lessons Jacob had taught him. There was something both comforting and painful about that continuity. After breakfast, Sarah cleared the dishes without being asked. Jacob watched her move around his cabin, efficient and capable. She wasn't treating this like a temporary shelter. She was already making herself at home. That should have bothered him more than it did. "We need to talk," Jacob said finally. "You said you're running from a marriage. I need to know the whole story." Sarah dried her hands on a towel and sat across from him. The morning light coming through the window made her look even younger. "His name is James Holloway," she began. "His father owns the biggest ranch in our part of Wyoming. 10,000 acres, 200 head of cattle, money and influence. And the son wants you," Jacob said. "The son thinks he owns me," Sarah corrected. "After my father died, I had debts. The ranch was small, and there'd been medical bills. I was managing, barely, but managing. Then my uncle, my father's brother, showed up. I barely knew him. He'd left Wyoming years ago, hadn't even come to my father's funeral. Jacob could see where this was heading. He took over. He said I was a woman alone, that I needed a man's guidance. He went to the Holloways, told them I was available for marriage. They offered to clear the debts in exchange for an arrangement. Sarah's voice was carefully controlled, but Jacob could hear the anger underneath. I didn't find out until the papers were already signed. My uncle had forged my signature. That's not legal, Jacob said. Legal doesn't matter much when the other family has enough money to make it legal, Sarah replied. The Holloways paid $500 to clear my debts. In their eyes, they own me now. James came to collect me 3 months ago. I told him no. He said it wasn't up to me. Jacob felt a cold anger settling in his gut. He'd seen this before. Powerful men treating women like property, like cattle to be bought and traded. So you left. I fought first, Sarah said, and now there was something fierce in her eyes. I told him I'd never marry him, that I'd rather die alone. He grabbed me, tried to force a kiss. I broke his nose with the butt of my father's rifle. Despite himself, Jacob felt a flicker of approval. Bet that surprised him? It did, but it also made things worse. He left, but he promised he'd be back with the law. Said I'd assaulted him, that I was unstable. I knew I had to leave before they could lock me up or drag me to a church. Sarah leaned forward. I spent the next month preparing. I sold what I could, packed what I needed, and started riding. I knew the general direction my father said you'd gone. I asked at every settlement, every trading post. Most people hadn't heard of you, but an old trapper in Durango said he knew a man named Stone who lived high up in the San Juans, a hermit who didn't want company. He drew me a rough map. Jacob shook his head slowly. You rode 300 miles on the word of one old trapper and a rough map. I didn't have anywhere else to go, Sarah said simply. And my father trusted you more than anyone else in the world. He said you were the finest man he'd ever known, that you'd taught him what it meant to have honor. I figured if I could find you, maybe you could help me figure out what to do next. Jacob stood and walked to the small shelf where he kept his few personal possessions. He reached behind a stack of books and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was the tin-type photograph he'd taken the night Margaret and the baby died. He rarely looked at it anymore. The pain had dulled over the years, but never fully disappeared. He set the box on the table in front of Sarah. Open it. She did, carefully. Her breath caught when she saw the photograph. A younger Jacob, clean-shaven and clear-eyed, standing beside a beautiful woman holding an infant wrapped in blankets. Margaret and Annie, Jacob said quietly. My wife and daughter. They died of fever 23 years ago. Annie was only 6 months old. Margaret went 3 days later. I buried them both on a hillside in Montana, and then I didn't know what to do with myself anymore. Sarah touched the photograph gently. I'm so sorry. I tried to keep working to stay on the ranch, but everything reminded me of them. Every room, every corner, every sunset. I started drinking, stopped caring about anything. The ranch owner, good man named Walker, he tried to help, but I was drowning, and I didn't want to be saved. That's when your father showed up. 17 years old, eager as a puppy, wanting to learn everything. Jacob sat back down. He followed me everywhere, asked 1,000 questions, wouldn't leave me alone even when I was cruel to him, which I was sometimes. He just kept coming back, kept trying, and slowly, without meaning to, he gave me a reason to get up in the morning. Teaching him, watching him grow, it helped. He loved you like a father, Sarah said softly. I know. That's why I left. Jacob met her eyes. I could feel myself getting attached, starting to care again, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't risk loving someone and losing them again. So one morning I just rode away. Didn't say goodbye, didn't explain. Just vanished into these mountains where loss couldn't follow. But it did follow, Sarah said. Loss always does, Jacob nodded slowly. Yes, it just took 20 years to catch up. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled something out. She set it on the table between them. A small wooden horse carved by hand, worn smooth with years of handling. Jacob felt his breath catch. He knew that horse. He'd carved it himself 17 years ago, during a slow afternoon on the ranch. Thomas had been pestering him about learning to work wood, so Jacob had shown him how to whittle. He'd made the horse as a demonstration, then given it to the boy. He carried this with him everywhere, Sarah said. Even when he got older, he kept it in his pocket. After he died, I found it in his things along with a note. It said, "This horse was made by the best man I ever knew. If you need help, find Jacob Stone. He'll know what to do. Jacob picked up the wooden horse with trembling hands. It was rough work, the proportions slightly off, the mane too thick. But he remembered making it, remembered Thomas's face when he'd handed it over. The boy's eyes had lit up like Jacob had given him gold. I don't know what to do, Jacob admitted, his voice rough. I don't know how to help you, Sarah. I'm just an old man hiding in the mountains. You're more than that, Sarah said firmly. You're the man my father trusted above everyone else. You're the reason I rode 300 miles through late-season weather. You're my last hope. The words hung in the air between them. Jacob wanted to deny them, to send her away, to retreat back into his comfortable solitude. But looking at Thomas's daughter, holding the wooden horse he'd carved so long ago, he found he couldn't do it. The Holloways will come looking for you, Jacob said finally. If you're worth $500 to them, they won't just let you disappear. I know, Sarah said. I've been watching my back trail. I don't think they've found me yet, but they will eventually. Someone will remember a woman traveling alone, asking questions. They'll follow. And when they get here, Sarah's jaw set in a determined line. Then we deal with it, together. Jacob wanted to argue, to explain that there was no together, that he'd sworn off partnerships and connections 20 years ago. But something in Sarah's eyes stopped him, not pleading or desperation, but a quiet strength that reminded him of her father. Thomas had had that same quality, a determination that bent but never broke. Your father was a good man, Jacob said quietly, one of the best I've known. He deserved better than I gave him. He thought the world of you until his dying day, Sarah replied. That's what matters. Jacob set the wooden horse back on the table. I'll teach you what I can. How to survive up here, how to take care of yourself. When spring comes, we'll figure out your next step. But Sarah, he met her eyes seriously, I can't promise anything beyond that. I'm not the man your father thought I was. I'm just someone who learned how to survive alone. That's exactly what I need to learn, Sarah said. How to survive, how to stand on my own, how to be strong enough that no one can ever own me. Jacob nodded slowly. Then that's what I'll teach you. But it won't be easy. Winter up here breaks people who aren't ready for it. I'm ready, Sarah said with quiet conviction. Looking at her, Jacob wasn't sure if she was or not. But he recognized the determination in her voice. It was the same determination that had carried him into these mountains 20 years ago and kept him alive ever since. Maybe Thomas's daughter had inherited more than his eyes and his jawline. Maybe she'd inherited his strength too. Tomorrow we start, Jacob said. I'll show you the trap lines, teach you to read the weather, show you how to preserve meat and gather the plants that'll keep scurvy away. You'll work harder than you ever have in your life. Good, Sarah said simply. Jacob stood and moved to the window again, looking out at the snow-covered world. His carefully constructed solitude had been shattered by a young woman carrying a wooden horse and her father's last words. He should have been angry, should have felt invaded. Instead, he felt something else, something that felt dangerously like purpose. You should know, Jacob said without turning around. I'm not good at this, at being around people, at caring what happens to them. I'll probably say the wrong things and be too harsh and not understand what you need. That's okay, Sarah's voice came from behind him. I'm not good at asking for help or accepting charity or admitting when I'm scared. We'll figure it out together. Together. That word again. Jacob had spent 20 years making sure there was no together in his life. And now, here was Thomas's daughter, disrupting everything, bringing the past crashing into the present with a wooden horse and a story of running from men who thought they could own her. He turned to face her. Your father would be proud of you. Coming this far, standing up for yourself. That took courage. Sarah's eyes glistened, but she blinked the tears away. I hope so. I hope I'm doing what he would have wanted. You are, Jacob said with certainty. And in that moment, he made a silent promise to Thomas Whitmore. The eager boy he'd abandoned 17 years ago, he'd protect this girl, teach her what she needed to know, and help her become strong enough to face whatever came next. It was the least he could do for the son he'd never had. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white silence. Inside the cabin, two people who'd been running from different kinds of pain found themselves in the same place, bound together by a dead man's love and a wooden horse carved long ago. It wasn't the beginning Jacob had expected, but perhaps it was the beginning he needed. The first full day together began before dawn, as all of Jacob's days did. He woke Sarah gently, still uncomfortable with having another person in his space, but determined to follow through on his promise to Thomas. "Time to work," he said simply. Sarah was dressed and ready within minutes. No complaints about the early hour or the cold that had seeped into the cabin overnight. Jacob noted this with approval. Complaining was a luxury that got people killed in the mountains. He showed her how he built up the fire each morning, the precise arrangement of kindling and logs that would burn hot enough to cook on, but not waste precious wood. Then he demonstrated his method of making coffee. Grounds measured carefully, water from the barrel he'd filled before the snow came, boiled just long enough to extract the flavor without making it bitter. "We checked the traps first," Jacob explained, as they ate a quick breakfast of fried cornmeal and the last of the eggs. "Every day, no matter the weather. An animal left too long in a trap suffers, and the pelt can be ruined by scavengers." "How far is the trap line?" Sarah asked. 3 hours round trip on a good day. "Longer in deep snow?" Jacob studied the sky through the window. "Today will be longer. We got 2 feet last night, and there's more coming." They dressed in layers, Sarah borrowing one of Jacob's extra coats, which hung large on her smaller frame. He gave her a pair of snowshoes he'd made years ago, but rarely used. They were too small for his feet, but fit Sarah well enough. "Stay behind me," Jacob instructed as they stepped outside. "Step where I step." The drifts hide deadfall and holes. A broken ankle up here is a death sentence. Sarah nodded seriously, and they set out into the white world. The morning was brutal in its beauty. The sun hadn't yet cleared the peaks, leaving the valley in blue-grey shadow. Their breath plumed in the frigid air, and the only sound was the crunch of snow under their snowshoes, and the occasional crack of a tree branch releasing its burden of ice. Jacob led them along the trap line he'd established years ago, each trap carefully placed near game trails or water sources. The first 3 traps were empty. The storm had kept the animals in their dens. The 4th held a marten, frozen solid, its dark fur perfect. "Watch," Jacob said, and showed Sarah how to remove the animal without damaging the pelt, how to reset the trap exactly as it had been. "You're not just taking from these mountains. You're part of them. Respect that." Sarah watched intently, asking questions that showed she was thinking, not just memorizing. "How did you know where to place the trap? How could you tell if a trail was active or abandoned? What other signs should you look for?" Jacob found himself slipping into the rhythm of teaching, something he hadn't done since Thomas. There was satisfaction in passing on knowledge, in watching understanding dawn in someone else's eyes. They were checking the 6th trap, deep in a stand of pine, when Jacob felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. Sarah froze behind him. "What?" she started to whisper. "Quiet," Jacob breathed. He'd survived 20 years in these mountains by trusting his instincts, and right now every instinct was screaming danger. He scanned the trees slowly, looking for movement, for anything out of place. Then he saw it. 50 feet away, partially hidden by a fallen log. A mountain lion, its tawny coat blending perfectly with the dead grass poking through the snow. It was watching them, its tail twitching slowly. Jacob's hand moved carefully to his rifle, easing it from his shoulder. He didn't take his eyes off the cat. Mountain lions didn't usually attack humans, but a hungry one in winter might take the chance, especially with 2 people who smelled like fear. "Sarah," Jacob said quietly, "when I tell you back away slowly, don't run. Keep your eyes on the cat. If it charges, make yourself big and make noise. Understand?" "Yes," Sarah whispered, and Jacob could hear the fear in her voice but also the control. She wasn't panicking. The lion rose from its crouch, muscles rippling under its coat. Jacob raised the rifle slowly, sighting down the barrel. He didn't want to kill the cat. It was just trying to survive like everything else up here. But he wouldn't hesitate if it came to protecting Sarah. Easy, Jacob said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the lion, Sarah, or himself. We're just passing through. The lion stared at them for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. Then with a flick of its tail, it turned and melted into the forest, disappearing as silently as it had appeared. Jacob waited a full minute before lowering the rifle. His heart was pounding, his hands steady, despite the surge of fear and adrenaline. Is it gone? Sarah asked. For now. Jacob turned to look at her. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. You did good. You stayed calm. I was terrified, Sarah admitted. Being terrified and staying calm aren't opposite things, Jacob said. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. Your father taught me that, Sarah managed a small smile. He used to say the same thing. They continued the trap line, both of them more alert now, aware of how quickly things could turn dangerous. Jacob found himself watching Sarah as much as the terrain, noticing how she moved, careful but not timid, learning the rhythm of the snowshoes, asking questions when something didn't make sense. By the time they returned to the cabin, it was midday and more snow was falling. They'd collected 2 more marten and a fox, good pelts that would bring fair prices. Inside, Jacob started a fire, while Sarah hung up their coats to dry. Now you learn to skin, Jacob said, and took her to the workbench he'd set up behind the cabin, sheltered under an overhang. The work was cold, precise, and not for the squeamish. Jacob showed her how to make the initial cuts, how to work the skin free from the meat without tearing it, how to stretch it on the frame to cure. Sarah watched closely, and when he handed her the knife and the second marten, she worked slowly but competently. My father taught me to dress deer and rabbits, she said as she worked. This isn't so different. It's not, Jacob agreed. Life and death, that's all hunting comes down to. Taking life to preserve your own. There's no shame in it, but there's no glory either. It's just what has to be done. They worked side by side in the cold, their breath misting, their hands going numb. When the pelts were stretched and set aside to cure, they went back inside where the fire had warmed the cabin to something approaching comfortable. Jacob made coffee, and they sat at the table, the afternoon light dimming early, as it did in winter. Sarah's hands were red from the cold and the work, but she didn't complain. Tell me about him, she said suddenly. About my father when you knew him. I have my memories, but I was young. I want to know what he was like when he was learning, when he was the age I am now. Jacob wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep into his frozen fingers. He'd spent so long not talking about the past that the words felt rusty. He was eager, Jacob said finally, almost too eager. He'd volunteer for anything, throw himself at any task, made mistakes because he rushed, but he never made the same mistake twice. That's the mark of someone worth teaching, not that they never fail, but that they learn from failing, Sarah smiled. That sounds like him. He was kind too, Jacob continued, in a world that doesn't always reward kindness. He'd spend his own money to buy feed for a neighbor's horse, stay up all night with a calving cow that wasn't even ours. The other hands teased him for it, called him soft. But your father, Jacob paused, remembering he didn't let it change him. He just kept being decent, kept helping where he could. He taught me that, Sarah said quietly. He used to say that the measure of a person wasn't what they did when someone was watching, but what they did when no one would ever know. Jacob felt something twist in his chest. He said that? All the time. I told him that, Jacob said. 20 years ago, when he asked me what made a good man, I didn't think he'd remember. He remembered everything you taught him, Sarah said. He talked about you even years later. The time you taught him to shoe a horse, the way you could read weather in the clouds, how you never lost your temper even when he messed things up. You shaped who he became. Jacob had to look away, overwhelmed by emotions he'd kept locked down for too long. I wish I'd stayed. I wish I'd been there when he understood why you left, Sarah interrupted gently. He told me about your wife and daughter. He said your heart was broken and you needed time to heal, even if that time ended up being forever. He never blamed you. Maybe he should have, Jacob said roughly. Maybe you should stop blaming yourself, Sarah replied. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling, the snow tapping against the windows. Jacob felt exposed, raw, like 20 years of protective scars had been peeled away in a single conversation. I can't replace him, Jacob said finally. I can't be the father you lost. I'm not asking you to be, Sarah said. I'm just asking you to help me become strong enough to face what's coming. That's all, Jacob nodded slowly. Then that's what we'll do. Tomorrow we'll work on reading sign tracking game. You need to be able to feed yourself if something happens to me. Nothing's going to happen to you, Sarah said with more confidence than the situation warranted. In these mountains, anything can happen, Jacob corrected. And you need to be ready for all of it. That evening, after a simple dinner of beans and salt pork, Sarah surprised him by producing a small book from her pack, a collection of poems. She read aloud by the firelight, her voice soft and steady, and Jacob found himself listening despite his usual impatience with such things. My father loved poetry, Sarah explained. He said it reminded him that there was beauty in the world even when things were hard. Jacob thought about that as he lay in his bed later, listening to Sarah's quiet breathing from her pallet by the fire. He'd spent 20 years focused only on survival, on enduring from one day to the next. He'd forgotten about beauty, about connection, about anything beyond the simple mechanics of staying alive. Thomas's daughter was reminding him of things he'd deliberately forgotten. It was uncomfortable and unsettling, and, if he was honest with himself, not entirely unwelcome. The cabin felt different with another person in it, warmer somehow, more alive. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the peaks with a sound like wolves singing. Jacob had always found comfort in that sound, proof that he was truly alone, truly isolated from the world that had hurt him so badly. But tonight, with Sarah sleeping peacefully near his fire, the wind sounded different. Not comforting, but lonely. For the first time in 20 years, Jacob Stone wondered if maybe isolation wasn't the same thing as safety, and if maybe, just maybe, the wall he'd built around his heart was less of a protection and more of a prison. He fell asleep with that uncomfortable thought and dreamed of Thomas Whitmore teaching his daughter to ride, to shoot, to survive. In the dream, Thomas looked at Jacob and said, "Take care of her. She's stronger than she knows." Jacob woke in the darkness, the dream still vivid, and whispered to the empty air, "I will. I promise." 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that Jacob found both strange and oddly comfortable. Each morning they rose before dawn, checked the traps, tended the horses, gathered wood. Sarah proved herself capable and willing, never shirking from hard work or complaining about the cold that could freeze fingers in minutes if you weren't careful. The cabin itself had changed. Small things mostly. Clothes hung on pegs Jacob had never bothered to use. The shelves organized in a way that actually made sense. Meals that consisted of more than just beans and salt pork. Sarah had found his stores of dried herbs and wild onions and turned simple fare into something that almost qualified as good. Jacob caught himself humming one morning as he stoked the fire, then stopped abruptly, unsettled by the sound of his own contentment. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked from where she was kneading dough for the bread she'd insisted on making. "Nothing," Jacob said. "Just not used to the noise," Sarah smiled. "I've hardly made any noise." "That's not what I mean," Jacob said, though he couldn't quite explain what he did mean. It was the noise of another person living, breathing, existing in a space he'd kept silent for 20 years. Even when she wasn't speaking, her presence filled the cabin in ways that both comforted and unsettled him. The third week brought a blizzard that trapped them inside for 3 straight days. The wind howled like a living thing, driving snow against the walls with such force that Jacob had to check constantly to make sure the drifts weren't blocking the door or covering the chimney. The temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the inside of the windows, despite the fire burning hot in the hearth. On the first day, they kept busy with tasks, Sarah mending clothes with thread and needle she'd brought, Jacob repairing a broken snowshoe and maintaining his traps. They spoke little, comfortable in the shared silence. The second day, restlessness set in. The cabin felt smaller, the walls closer. Sarah paced like a caged animal, and Jacob found himself snapping at her for minor things. A cup left on the wrong shelf. "Too much wood on the fire, I'm sorry," he said finally, recognizing his own unfairness. "I'm not used to being cooped up with company." "I'm not used to being cooped up at all," Sarah replied. "My father always said I had restless feet. He got that from me," Jacob admitted. "I taught him that staying still too long made you soft. Gods, I've been staying still in these mountains for 20 years, so maybe I was wrong about that." Sarah sat at the table, pulling her shawl tighter. Even with the fire, the cold was seeping in. "Tell me about before," she said. "Before you came here, before you lost your wife and daughter." Jacob's first instinct was to refuse, to shut down the conversation before it could open old wounds. But something in Sarah's eyes, a genuine curiosity, not morbid fascination, made him reconsider. "I was different then," he said slowly. "Younger, obviously, but more than that. I believed in things. Family, future, the possibility of happiness. I was a cavalry scout for a while. Then I got tired of the military and hired on with a ranching operation in Montana. That's where I met Margaret. What was she like?" Sarah asked. Jacob closed his eyes, summoning the memory. "Strong, not physically, though she was that too. Strong in spirit. She could look at you and see right through any pretense, any lie you told yourself. She saw me, really saw me, and she loved me anyway. That's a rare thing." "It is," Sarah agreed softly. "We married quick, maybe too quick by some folks' standards. But when you know, you know. We had a small house on the ranch, nothing fancy. She made it feel like a palace. Then Annie came along, and Jacob's voice caught. Even after all these years, this part hurt. She was perfect, tiny, with Margaret's dark hair and my eyes. She'd grab my finger and hold on like she never wanted to let go. What happened?" Sarah's voice was gentle. "Fever swept through that part of Montana. Started in town, spread to the ranches. Annie got sick first, 6 months old, and there was nothing we could do. We tried everything, cold baths, herbal remedies, prayers. She died in Margaret's arms on a Tuesday morning." Jacob stood, needing to move. "Margaret got sick 2 days later. She fought it, tried to stay strong for me. But you could see in her eyes she didn't want to. She wanted to be with Annie. She died 3 days later, and I—" He stopped, his throat tight. "I buried them on a hillside where Margaret used to like to sit and watch the sunset. Then I went a little crazy. I'm so sorry," Sarah said, and there was such genuine compassion in her voice that Jacob had to look away. "Thomas found me about a year after that. I'd stopped drinking by then, but I was still broken. He was this eager kid who wouldn't leave me alone, who kept trying to make me care about things again. And slowly, despite myself, he did. I started teaching him things, started finding purpose in watching him grow. But then I realized I was getting attached, and I couldn't—" Jacob shook his head. "I couldn't do it. I couldn't risk loving someone and losing them again. So you left, so I left. Came to these mountains where nothing could touch me, where I didn't have to care about anyone or anything. And for 20 years I convinced myself I was better off." Jacob turned to face Sarah. "Then you showed up with a wooden horse and your father's last words, and you're making me question everything I thought I knew." Sarah stood and moved to the window, looking out at the white void of the blizzard. "My father used to say that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's fear. He said too many people never let themselves love because they're too afraid of the pain that might come. But he said the pain of loneliness is worse than the pain of loss, because at least loss means you had something worth losing." "He was wiser than I gave him credit for," Jacob said. "He learned from the best," Sarah replied. Looking back at him, they spent the rest of the day in quiet companionship, the tension from earlier gone. Sarah taught Jacob a card game Thomas had taught her. A simple thing, but it made Jacob laugh when she beat him 3 times in a row. "You're cheating," he accused without heat. "I'm just better at this than you are," Sarah countered. Grinning, that night the wind died down enough that they could hear themselves think. Sarah made a stew from dried meat and vegetables, and they ate by firelight. Jacob found himself watching her, the way she moved, the expressions that crossed her face. the strength in her hands that came from years of hard work. She was beautiful, he realized with a start. Not in the polished way of town women, but in the way of wild things, practical, capable, real. Then he felt ashamed for noticing. She was young enough to be his daughter, and she'd come to him for protection, not, "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, catching him staring. "Nothing," Jacob said quickly. "Just tired." But later, lying in his bed while Sarah slept by the fire, Jacob admitted the truth to himself. He was noticing Sarah as more than Thomas's daughter, more than a person he was helping. He was noticing her as a woman, and that terrified him more than any blizzard or mountain lion ever could. The third day of the storm, the wind finally died. They ventured outside to find the world transformed. Drifts as high as the cabin's roof. Trees bent nearly double under the weight of ice. The sky, clear and brilliant blue. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed. "Standing in snow up to her knees, it's deadly," Jacob corrected. But even he had to admit there was something magnificent about the pristine white landscape. "We need to dig out the horses, check the traps, make sure the roof hasn't been damaged." They worked together, falling into the easy partnership they'd developed. Sarah no longer needed detailed instructions. She anticipated what needed to be done and did it. Jacob found himself relying on her in ways he hadn't relied on anyone in 20 years. When they checked the trap line that afternoon, they found that the storm had been both cruel and kind. 2 traps had been buried and would need to be relocated, but 3 others held prime pelts. Fox, marten, and a lynx with fur so thick and perfect that Jacob knew it would bring top price. "We're going to need to go to Pine Ridge soon," Jacob said as they headed back to the cabin, carrying their haul. "Supplies are running low, and I need to trade these pelts before they start to deteriorate." He felt Sarah tense beside him. "How soon?" she asked. "Week, maybe 2 if we stretch what we have. But we'll need flour, coffee, salt, things we can't make ourselves." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "What if someone recognizes me? What if the Holloways have spread word?" Jacob had been thinking about that. Pine Ridge is small, but it's isolated. News travels slow this time of year, and even if someone has heard something, these mountain folk mind their own business. They won't ask questions they don't want answers to. "You hope," Sarah said. "I hope," Jacob agreed. "But we don't have much choice. We can't survive the winter without supplies." That evening, Sarah was quieter than usual. She sat by the fire, staring into the flames, her hands working a piece of leather she was softening for new gloves. "What are you afraid of?" Jacob asked finally. Sarah looked up, surprised by the directness of the question. "That they'll find me. That they'll take me back. That I'll have fought this hard for nothing." "They won't take you," Jacob said with more certainty than he felt. "I won't let them." "You can't promise that," Sarah said. "You're one man, and the Holloways have money and influence, and I have 20 years of surviving in conditions that would kill most men," Jacob interrupted. "I have knowledge of this country that no amount of money can buy. And I have—" He paused, surprised by what he was about to say. "I have something worth protecting now. That makes a man dangerous in ways money never could." Sarah's eyes glistened in the firelight. "Why are you doing this, really? Is it just because of my father?" Jacob considered lying, giving her the easy answer. But Thomas's daughter deserved the truth, even if it made him uncomfortable to speak it. At first, yes, I owed Thomas that much. But now, Jacob looked at her directly, "and now it's because you remind me what it's like to care about someone other than myself. You've been here less than a month, and you've changed everything. This cabin that was just a place to survive is starting to feel like a home. Days that were just about enduring are starting to mean something again." "Jacob," Sarah started. "Let me finish," he said. "I'm too old for you, too set in my ways, too damaged by things I can't change. But you've made me remember what it's like to be alive instead of just existing. That's a gift I didn't expect and don't deserve." Sarah set down her work and stood, moving to where Jacob sat at the table. She placed her hand on his shoulder, and he felt the warmth of it through his shirt. "You're not too old," she said quietly. "You're not too damaged. And you deserve more than you think you do. My father saw that." "I see that," Jacob covered her hand with his own, marveling at how small and strong it felt. "Your father was an optimist. My father was right about you," Sarah said firmly. "And eventually you'll see it too." She went back to her work, and Jacob sat in the warmth of her words, feeling something shift inside him. Not quite hope, but maybe the possibility of hope. The medicine pouch he kept hanging by the door, filled with herbs for physical ailments, seemed like a symbol now of the healing that was happening in this cabin, not just in bodies, but in hearts that had thought themselves beyond repair. The next morning, they prepared for the journey to Pine Ridge. Jacob showed Sarah how to pack for travel, efficiently, with every item serving multiple purposes. They would take 2 horses, leading a pack animal with the pelts. "We'll stay over one night," Jacob explained. "There's a boarding house run by a widow named Eleanor Brennan. She's fair and she doesn't gossip much. We'll tell her you're Thomas Whitmore's daughter, staying the winter to learn mountain skills." "That's true enough. And if people ask more questions, then we'll answer what we have to and nothing more," Jacob said. "The thing about mountain folk is they understand the need for privacy. Most of them came here to get away from something themselves. They set out on a cold, clear morning, the horse's breath steaming in the frigid air. The journey to Pine Ridge would take 2 days through mountain passes and frozen valleys. Jacob led the way, Sarah following close behind, both of them alert for signs of danger, animal or human. As they rode, Jacob found himself explaining things without being asked. Which trees to use for emergency shelter, how to tell if ice was thick enough to cross, where to find water when everything was frozen. Sarah absorbed it all, asking smart questions, making connections he hadn't expected. "You're a good teacher," she said, as they stopped to rest the horses. "You're a good student," Jacob replied. "Like your father." They made camp that first night in a grove of pines that offered some shelter from the wind. Jacob built a fire while Sarah tended the horses. They worked together smoothly, each knowing their role. Over a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, they talked about small things, the quality of the pelts they were carrying, the weather patterns Jacob had noticed, the herbs Sarah wanted to gather come spring. Ordinary conversation, but it felt precious to Jacob, who'd gone years without talking to anyone at all. As the fire burned down and the stars came out in brilliant array, Sarah asked, "Do you ever think about going back? To Montana, to the places you knew before?" Jacob was quiet for a long time. "Sometimes, but the people I knew there are gone, and the place wouldn't be the same. Memory has a way of making things better than they were. The Montana I remember doesn't exist anymore. If it ever did, do you regret coming here?" "I did at first. Thought I was running away, being a coward. But now I think maybe I was just surviving the only way I knew how. Sometimes removing yourself from a situation isn't weakness, it's wisdom." Jacob looked at Sarah across the fire. "Like you leaving Wyoming. That wasn't running. That was choosing yourself over what other people wanted for you." Sarah pulled her blanket tighter. "I hope you're right. Some days I wonder if I should have just accepted it, made the best of a bad situation." "No," Jacob said firmly. "A life lived for someone else's benefit isn't a life at all. It's just existence. Your father understood that. He taught you to value yourself enough to fight for what you deserve." "He did," Sarah agreed softly. "I just wish he was here to see that I listened." "He knows," Jacob said. "Wherever he is, he knows." They fell asleep under the stars, the fire burning low between them, the horses quiet nearby. Jacob woke once in the night and saw Sarah sleeping peacefully, her face relaxed in a way it rarely was during the day. He felt a fierce protectiveness rise in him, a determination that nothing would happen to this young woman who'd ridden 300 miles to find him. He'd failed Thomas by leaving. He wouldn't fail Thomas's daughter by letting anyone take her back to a life she didn't want. Whatever came, whatever it cost, he'd make sure Sarah had the chance to choose her own path. With that promise made to himself and to the memory of a boy who'd believed in him when he hadn't believed in himself, Jacob Stone closed his eyes and slept dreamlessly until dawn. They reached Pine Ridge just after noon on the second day. The settlement consisted of perhaps 20 buildings scattered along a frozen creek, A general store, a saloon, a boarding house, a church, and various homes and outbuildings. Smoke rose from chimneys into the cold air, and a few people moved about their business, bundled against the cold. Jacob felt Sarah tense as they rode down the main street. He understood her anxiety. After weeks alone in the mountains, the presence of other people felt intrusive, potentially dangerous. "Easy," he said quietly. "Let me do the talking." They stopped first at the general store, a long building with a covered porch. Ezra Hawkins, the owner, was a man in his 60s with a face weathered by decades of mountain winters. He looked up from his ledger as they entered, and his eyes widened slightly at seeing Jacob with a companion. "Jacob Stone," Ezra said, genuine surprise in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you until spring. Supplies ran low," Jacob said simply. "Ezra, this is Sarah Whitmore, Thomas Whitmore's daughter." Ezra's expression shifted to something more respectful. "Thomas Whitmore, good man. Heard he passed some years back." "My condolences, miss." "Thank you," Sarah said quietly. "She's staying the winter," Jacob continued, "learning to manage in the high country. I need the usual, flour, coffee, salt, sugar if you have it, and I've got pelts to trade." While Ezra examined the pelts, nodding appreciatively at the quality, Jacob noticed other people in the store casting curious glances their way. Two women by the fabric bolts whispered to each other. An old prospector by the tobacco openly stared. "Fine pelts," Ezra said finally. "The links especially. They can give you fair credit, enough to cover your supplies and then some." They completed the transaction with the efficiency of two men who'd done business together for years. As Ezra's son loaded their supplies onto the pack horse, Ezra leaned closer to Jacob. "There's been talk," he said quietly. "Strangers came through about a week ago, asking about a young woman traveling alone. Said she was disturbed, ran away from family, offered money for information." Jacob felt his jaw tighten. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing. Hadn't seen anyone matching that description, which was true at the time." Ezra glanced at Sarah, who was examining some fabric with forced interest. "But others might not be so careful with their words. Just thought you should know." "Appreciated," Jacob said. As they stepped out of the store, a woman's voice called out, "Jacob Stone, is that really you with a woman?" Eleanor Brennan stood on the porch of her boarding house across the street. She was perhaps 55, with iron-grey hair and a face that could be stern or kind, depending on her mood. Right now she looked delighted and curious in equal measure. "Eleanor," Jacob acknowledged, leading Sarah across the street. "This is Sarah Whitmore," Eleanor finished, her eyes sharp with intelligence. "Thomas Whitmore's girl, I heard. News travels fast in a small town." She smiled at Sarah warmly. "Your father stayed at my boarding house once, about 15 years ago. He was a gentleman and paid his bill on time, which makes him memorable in my business." Sarah relaxed slightly. "It's nice to meet you, Mom." "Come inside," Eleanor said, waving them toward the door. "I've got hot coffee and fresh bread, and I imagine you both could use something that isn't cooked over a campfire." The boarding house was warm and clean, with simple but comfortable furnishings. Eleanor led them to a table in the dining room and brought coffee and thick slices of bread with butter and jam. Sarah's eyes lit up at the sight of real jam, something they didn't have in the mountains. "Now then," Eleanor said, sitting with them, "I imagine there's a story here, and I'm too old to pretend I'm not curious. But I'm also old enough to know when not to ask questions. So I'll just say this, if you need rooms for the night, I have 2 available. And if you need someone who knows how to keep her mouth shut, that's also available." Jacob found himself grateful for Eleanor's directness. 2 rooms would be good, and discretion would be appreciated, Eleanor nodded. "The men who came through last week, they weren't the sort I liked. Too smooth, too confident. The kind who think money makes them better than everyone else. They're staying at the saloon down in Willow Creek, about 30 miles south. Or they were when they left here." "Thank you for the information," Sarah said quietly. "Your father was a good man," Eleanor said, her voice gentler. "And Jacob here, despite being a hermit who barely talks to anyone, is decent folk. That's enough for me. Now eat up, and then I'll show you to your rooms. You both look like you could use a proper night's sleep in an actual bed." After they finished eating, Eleanor led them upstairs. She gave Sarah a room at the front of the house, small but clean, with a real bed and a window that looked out on the street. Jacob's room was next door, similar in size. "There's a bathing room at the end of the hall," Eleanor said. "Hot water costs extra, but I suspect you'll both want it. I'll heat some up." When Eleanor left, Jacob turned to Sarah. "Stay in your room tonight. Don't wander around town alone." "I'm not a child," Sarah said, a flash of irritation in her eyes. "No, but you're someone people are looking for. And this town, small as it is, has eyes everywhere." Jacob's voice was firm. "I'm not trying to control you. I'm trying to keep you safe." Sarah's expression softened. "I know, I'm sorry. I hate hiding, feeling like I've done something wrong when I haven't." "I know," Jacob said. "But sometimes the right thing and the safe thing aren't the same. Tomorrow we'll get our business done and head back to the mountains." "One more day, that's all," Sarah nodded reluctantly. "One more day." That evening, after a hot bath that made Jacob feel almost human again, he went down to the saloon. Not to drink. He'd learned that lesson years ago, but to listen. Saloons were where information flowed, where you learned what was happening in the wider world. The Pine Ridge Saloon was small and smoky, with a dozen men scattered at tables. Jacob recognized most of them, trappers, prospectors, a few ranch hands from the lower valleys. He ordered coffee at the bar, ignoring the knowing looks from men who remembered when he'd ordered whiskey instead. Clayton Pierce, an old rancher who'd been working these mountains longer than Jacob, waved him over to a table. "Stone," Clayton said. "Heard you came down with company." "That's news. Thomas Whitmore's daughter," Jacob said, sitting. "Teaching her to survive the high country." Clayton's weathered face creased in a smile. "Teaching, is that what they're calling it now?" "It's exactly what I'm calling it," Jacob said coolly. "Her father was a friend. I'm honoring his memory." Clayton held up his hands. "No offense meant. Just surprised to see you with any kind of company after all these years. Figured you'd taken a vow of solitude or something." "Not a vow, just a preference." Jacob sipped his coffee. "Heard there were strangers in town last week." "There were," Clayton confirmed, his expression darkening. "3 men from Wyoming. Rich boys playing at being tough. They were asking about a runaway girl, saying she was disturbed, needed to be returned to her family for her own good." "What did people tell them?" "Most folks told them nothing. We don't care much for outsiders coming here with demands and money." Clayton leaned closer. "But there's always someone willing to talk for the right price. Dutch Miller, that prospector who's always half drunk, he told them he'd seen a young woman heading north into the high country. Didn't know which valley, but he pointed them in the general direction." Jacob's hands tightened on his coffee cup. "When was this?" 5 days ago. They headed out the next morning with supplies for a week. If they're smart, they'll have turned back by now. But if they're stubborn," Clayton shrugged, "they could still be out there looking." Jacob felt cold dread settle in his stomach. If the Holloway's men were in the mountains looking for Sarah, they might find his cabin. Even if they didn't find it before the weather turned, they'd know the general area. Come spring, they'd be back. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Clayton asked. "That I've got trouble heading my way?" "Could be. Or could be those city boys already froze to death in a gully somewhere." Clayton studied Jacob. "This girl means something to you?" Jacob considered his answer carefully. "She's someone who needs help, and I'm someone who can provide it." "That's not what I asked. It's all I'm saying," Jacob replied. Clayton nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Just be careful, Stone. Men with money don't like being told no. And they especially don't like losing something they think they own." Jacob left the saloon shortly after, his mind working through possibilities and preparations. If the Holloway's men found his cabin, he needed to be ready. He needed to make sure Sarah knew what to do, where to go, if things went bad. He was crossing the street back to the boarding house when he heard raised voices. 2 young men, ranch hands by the look of them, were standing outside the general store. One of them was gesturing animatedly. "I'm telling you, I saw her through the window," the man was saying. "Pretty thing traveling with old Stone. Wonder what arrangement they've got going." His companion laughed crudely. "Maybe the hermit's not as dead below the belt as we thought." Jacob felt anger surge through him, hot and sudden. He'd spent 20 years avoiding confrontation, walking away from provocation. But hearing Sarah's name dragged through mud by men who knew nothing about her or the situation, that was different. He crossed to where the men stood, his approach quiet enough that they didn't notice until he was right in front of them. "Something you want to say about Miss Whitmore?" Jacob asked, his voice deceptively calm. The men turned, startled. The first one, emboldened by drink, sneered, "Just wondering what a young thing like that is doing, shacked up with an old man in the mountains. Seems like there's only one explanation." Jacob's fist moved before he consciously decided to throw it. The punch caught the man square in the jaw, sending him stumbling backward into his friend. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs. "The lady is Thomas Whitmore's daughter," Jacob said, his voice hard as iron. "She's learning mountain skills, and she's under my protection. Anyone who says different will answer to me. Are we clear?" The first man scrambled to his feet, hand on his jaw, eyes wide with shock. He'd expected anger, maybe, but not violence from a man in his 60s. "We didn't mean nothing." "Yes, you did," Jacob interrupted. "Now you know better." Clayton Pierce had emerged from the saloon, drawn by the commotion. "Problem here, Stone?" "No problem," Jacob said, not taking his eyes off the two ranch hands. "Just a misunderstanding that's been cleared up." The men nodded quickly and hurried off down the street. Jacob stood there for a moment, his hand throbbing where he'd connected with bone, adrenaline still coursing through him. "Feel better?" Clayton asked, amusement in his voice. "No," Jacob admitted. "But it needed saying, with your fist." "Sometimes that's the only language that gets heard." Jacob flexed his hand, wincing. He'd probably bruised his knuckles. "I'm too old for this." "You move pretty quick for an old man," Clayton observed. "But you're right, fighting in the street isn't smart. Word will spread. The people looking for that girl will hear you're protective of her." "That tells them something," Jacob nodded grimly. "I know. But I couldn't let it stand." Back at the boarding house, Eleanor was waiting in the lobby. She took one look at Jacob's face and shook her head. "Let me guess. Someone said something inappropriate about your young friend, and you decided to educate them with your fists." "News travels fast," Jacob muttered. "Always does." Eleanor gestured for him to sit, then went to fetch a cloth and some ice. When she returned, she wrapped the ice in the cloth and handed it to him. "Put that on your hand before it swells too badly." Jacob did as instructed, grateful for her matter-of-fact approach. "I shouldn't have hit him." "Probably not," Eleanor agreed. "But I understand why you did. These mountain men talk rough, but most of them are harmless. Still, a young woman's reputation is fragile, and you did right by defending it." "It's not just her reputation I'm worried about," Jacob admitted. "There are people looking for her. Men with money who think they have a claim on her." Eleanor sat across from him, her expression serious. "The men who came through last week, yes. They told Sarah's uncle that she was promised in marriage, paid money to seal the arrangement. Then they came to collect her, and she refused. So she ran." "Good for her," Eleanor said firmly. "A woman should have the right to choose her own life." "I agree. But the law might not see it that way, especially if money changed hands." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Sarah needs a guardian, someone with legal authority to speak for her interests. Her father's dead, but did he leave a will?" Jacob blinked. "I don't know." "She never mentioned one. If he did, and if he named someone other than her uncle as guardian, that would supersede any arrangement the uncle made." Eleanor stood. "I'll talk to Sarah in the morning. If Thomas Whitmore was as careful as I remember, he might have planned for this." "Why are you helping us?" Jacob asked. Eleanor smiled. "Because I've lived long enough to know that love shows up in unexpected places, and age is just a number when two people genuinely care for each other. It's not—" Jacob started to protest. "Isn't it?" Eleanor interrupted gently. "I saw how you looked at her in the dining room, and how she looked at you. Maybe you haven't admitted it to yourselves yet, but it's there. And there's nothing wrong with it, despite what small-minded people might say." Jacob felt heat rise in his face. "She's young enough to be my daughter. She's a grown woman who survived loss, hardship, and a 300-mile journey through dangerous country to find you. That's not a child. That's someone who knows her own mind." Eleanor patted his shoulder. "Don't let fear of what others think stop you from living, Jacob. You've been alone long enough." She left him sitting there with ice on his hand and uncomfortable truths in his mind. He'd convinced himself that his feelings for Sarah were purely protective, born of his connection to her father. But if he was honest, truly honest, there was more to it than that. He cared for her, not just as Thomas's daughter, not just as someone under his protection, but as Sarah herself. Her strength, her determination, her kindness. The way she listened when he talked, really listened, like his words mattered. The way she'd transformed his cabin from a hermit's cave into something that felt like a home, and that terrified him more than any threat from the Holloways ever could. The next morning, Jacob woke early and found Eleanor already in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Sarah came down shortly after, looking rested but wary. "How's your hand?" Sarah asked, noticing the bruising on Jacob's knuckles. "Fine," Jacob said. "Just a misunderstanding last night." Eleanor set plates of eggs and bacon in front of them. "The misunderstanding where Jacob defended your honor with his fists." Sarah's eyes widened. "What?" "Some ranch hands were talking loosely," Jacob said, uncomfortable with the attention. "I corrected them. You hit someone for talking about me." Sarah looked torn between gratitude and concern. "Jacob, you could have been hurt or arrested. I'm fine. And they won't talk like that again." Jacob met her eyes. "I won't let anyone disrespect you, Sarah, not while I'm around." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. Eleanor watched with knowing eyes, but said nothing. After breakfast, Eleanor pulled Sarah aside. Jacob watched them talk quietly in the corner, saw Sarah's expression shift from surprise to hope to something like relief. When they rejoined him, Sarah's eyes were bright. "My father did leave a will," she said. "I'd forgotten, but Eleanor reminded me. He filed it with her years ago when he stayed here. He named Eleanor as my legal guardian if anything happened to him. Which means," Eleanor added, "any arrangement made by Sarah's uncle without my knowledge or consent is invalid. I have the papers to prove it." Jacob felt relief wash over him. "That changes everything." "It does," Eleanor agreed. "If those men come back, we have legal ground to stand on. Sarah is under my guardianship, and she's choosing to spend the winter learning from you. There's nothing improper or illegal about that." They spent the rest of the morning at Eleanor's table, going over the details of the guardianship. Eleanor produced the will from her safe. Thomas Whitmore had been thorough, naming Eleanor specifically, and noting that his brother was not to have any authority over his daughter. "Your father was a smart man," Eleanor said to Sarah. "He knew his brother couldn't be trusted. I wish he'd told me," Sarah said quietly. "He probably thought he had time," Eleanor replied. "We all think we have more time than we do." By midday, they were ready to leave. Jacob had the supplies loaded, the horses rested and fed. Eleanor stood on her porch, watching them prepare to depart. "You come back if you need anything," she told Sarah. "And you," she fixed Jacob with a stern look, "you take care of her. And yourself. You're not as young as you think you are, throwing punches in the street." "I'll remember that," Jacob said dryly. As they rode out of Pine Ridge, Sarah was quiet. Jacob let her have her thoughts until they were clear of the settlement and back in the open country. "What are you thinking?" he asked finally. "That I'm grateful," Sarah said. "For Eleanor, for you, for the fact that my father planned ahead, even though he never told me. It feels like," she paused, searching for words, "like I'm not alone in this, like there are people who care what happens to me." "There are," Jacob said simply. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the horses' hooves crunching in the snow, the sun weak but present in the winter sky. Jacob found his mind drifting to what Eleanor had said, about love showing up in unexpected places, about not letting fear stop you from living. He'd built his life around fear, he realized. Fear of loss, fear of pain, fear of caring too much. He'd thought isolation was safety, but maybe it was just another kind of prison. "Jacob." Sarah's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Yes, thank you. For everything. For letting me stay, for teaching me, for defending me. I know it's not what you wanted, having someone disrupt your life." Jacob considered his response carefully. "At first you're right. I didn't want the disruption. But now..." He looked at her riding beside him, strong and determined and more capable than she'd been even a month ago. Now I'm glad you came. You've reminded me of things I'd forgotten. Like what? Like how to care about someone other than myself. Like how to have purpose beyond just surviving. Like how to live instead of just existing. Jacob smiled slightly. Your father gave me that once. Now you're giving it to me again. Sarah reached over and touched his arm briefly, a gesture of affection and gratitude. He'd be happy we found each other. Yes, Jacob agreed. He would. They made camp that night in the same pine grove where they'd stopped on the journey down. But this time, the mood was different, lighter somehow. Despite the news about the Holloway's men searching for Sarah, they had a plan now, legal protection, and allies they could count on. As they sat by the fire, Sarah asked, "What happens in the spring? When the pass is clear and those men can come back." "We'll be ready," Jacob said. "And we'll have Eleanor's papers to prove you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you want to do." "And if they don't care about papers?" Jacob's expression hardened. "Then they'll learn what happens when you try to take something from a mountain man. These peaks have been my home for 20 years. I know every valley, every pass, every place where a man can hide or make a stand. If they want trouble, I'll give them more than they bargained for." Sarah smiled at the fierce protectiveness in his voice. "I believe you." That night, lying in their separate bedrolls with the fire burning between them, Jacob found himself staring at the stars and thinking about the silver wedding band he still wore. He'd carried Margaret with him for 23 years, let her memory define every choice he made, but maybe it was time to let go. Not to forget her, he'd never forget her, but to allow himself the possibility of moving forward. Margaret would have wanted that. She'd never been selfish, never would have wanted him to sacrifice decades of his life to grief. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he'd take off the ring. Not as a rejection of what he'd had, but as an acceptance of what might be possible. It was time to stop living in the past and start living in the present, with all its uncertainty and risk and potential for joy. Beside him, Sarah slept peacefully, trusting him to keep watch, trusting him to keep her safe. And Jacob Stone, who'd spent 20 years trusting no one and nothing, found that he wanted to be worthy of that trust more than he'd wanted anything in a very long time. They returned to the cabin in the late afternoon of the second day, both relieved to be back in the familiar surroundings. The journey had been uneventful, but Jacob had found himself constantly scanning the landscape, alert for any sign of the men who might be searching for Sarah. The cabin felt different now, warmer somehow, more welcoming. Sarah immediately set about making coffee and heating up the stew she'd prepared. Before they left, Jacob tended the horses, checking them carefully for any sign of strain from the journey. That evening, after they'd eaten and settled by the fire, Jacob did something he'd been thinking about since their conversation the night before. He reached up and slowly pulled the silver wedding band from his finger. Sarah noticed immediately. "Jacob, it's time," he said quietly, looking at the ring in his palm. It was worn smooth, the inscription inside barely legible after 23 years of constant wear. "I've been holding on to the past so tight that I couldn't see the present. Margaret wouldn't have wanted that." He stood and moved to the small wooden box where he kept the tin-type photograph. He placed the ring inside, next to the image of his wife and daughter, then closed the lid gently. "I'll always love them," Jacob said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I'm ready to stop using that love as a wall against everything else." Sarah stood and moved to his side. She didn't say anything, just placed her hand in his. Her fingers were warm, alive, real. Jacob squeezed gently, grateful for the comfort and the understanding. "Your father would be proud of you," he said, looking down at her. "You've grown stronger every day since you've been here. You're not the scared girl who showed up in the snow. You're someone who can survive anything." "I had a good teacher," Sarah replied, her eyes meeting his. "And maybe I wasn't looking for just survival. Maybe I was looking for something more." The air between them felt charged, full of unspoken possibilities. Jacob knew he should step back, maintain the appropriate distance. But for the first time in 20 years, he didn't want to. He wanted to close the distance, to take the risk, to allow himself the possibility of connection. "Sarah," he began, but she placed her fingers gently on his lips. "Don't," she said softly. "Don't talk yourself out of this. Don't give me all the reasons why you're too old or too broken or too anything. I know who you are, Jacob Stone. I've seen you at your most vulnerable and at your strongest. And I choose you. I choose this. You barely know me," Jacob protested weakly. "I know enough. I know you're kind even when you try to hide it. I know you're brave even when you claim you're just surviving. I know you defend people you care about, even if it means getting hurt yourself." Sarah's hand moved to his cheek, rough with his beard. "I know you've been alone long enough. We both have. 3 days after finding the boot prints, the men came. Jacob was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard the horses. He froze, axe in mid-swing, every sense suddenly alert. Sarah was inside making bread. He could smell it baking. His rifle was leaning against the woodpile, 20 feet away. He moved quickly but carefully, retrieving the weapon and checking the load. Then he circled around the cabin, positioning himself where he could see the front approach, while staying concealed behind a stack of firewood. 4 riders emerged from the tree line. 3 were rough-looking men in heavy coats, the kind who made their living doing other people's dirty work. But the 4th man, younger, well-dressed even for the wilderness, riding a horse that cost more than most men made in a year, that had to be James Holloway. Jacob had seen his type before. Rich men's sons who thought money and good looks entitled them to whatever they wanted. The kind who'd never been told no and couldn't comprehend the word when they finally heard it. The riders stopped 50 feet from the cabin. Holloway surveyed the building with an expression of distaste, as if he couldn't believe anyone would choose to live in such primitive conditions. "Stone," Holloway called out. "Jacob Stone! I know you're here. I can see smoke from your chimney." Jacob remained hidden, watching, waiting. He'd learned patience in these mountains. Knowing when to move and when to stay still could mean the difference between life and death. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Holloway continued, his voice carrying easily in the cold air. "I'm just here for what's mine. Send out Sarah Whitmore, and we'll leave peacefully. You can go back to your solitary life, and everyone's happy." Inside the cabin, Jacob knew Sarah had heard. He'd told her what to do if this moment came. Stay quiet, stay low, keep the spare rifle loaded and ready. He hoped she'd listen. "Mr. Stone," one of the hired men said, his hand resting casually on his pistol, "we can do this easy, or we can do it hard. Your choice." Jacob stepped out from behind the woodpile, rifle held ready but not aimed. "That's far enough," he said, his voice calm. "State your business and then ride on." Holloway's eyes fixed on him, assessing. "So you are here. Good. As I said, I'm here for Sarah Whitmore. She's promised to my family and she's coming back with us." "The lady isn't going anywhere she doesn't want to go," Jacob replied. "The lady," Holloway said with a sneer, "doesn't have a choice. My family paid good money to clear her debts. That makes her obligated to honor the arrangement, an arrangement she didn't agree to, made by a man who had no legal right to make it." Holloway's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his face. "What are you talking about?" "Sarah's father left a will, properly filed and legal. He named a guardian other than her uncle. Any arrangement made without that guardian's consent is invalid." Jacob took a step forward. "So you've got no claim here. Time to ride on." The 3 hired men exchanged glances, uncertain, but Holloway's face darkened with anger. "You're lying. Trying to protect your little arrangement up here. Everyone in Pine Ridge is talking about it. The old hermit and the young girl, alone in the mountains. Makes a man wonder what's really going on." Jacob felt fury rise in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "What's going on is none of your concern. Sarah Whitmore is under legal guardianship, learning wilderness skills, and she's staying because she chooses to. Now get off my property. Your property." Holloway laughed. "You're squatting on public land, old man. You've got no more right to be here than anyone else." "I've been here 20 years, Jacob said. "That gives me all the right I need." Holloway made a gesture, and one of the hired men began to dismount. "We're going inside that cabin, and we're taking Sarah with us. You can stand aside or you can get hurt. Either way, we're leaving with what we came for." Jacob raised the rifle, sighting directly on Holloway's chest. You take one more step toward my cabin, and I'll put a bullet in your employer. Then I'll reload and put one in each of you. I can drop 4 men before you clear Leather, and I will if you make me." The hired men froze. They might be willing to face danger for money, but facing a man who was clearly comfortable with killing, that was different. "You're bluffing," Holloway said. But there was uncertainty in his voice now. "I'm really not," Jacob replied. "I'm 63 years old, and I've survived in these mountains for 20 years. You think I've done that by being soft? Test me, please." A tense silence stretched out. The horses shifted nervously, sensing the violence hanging in the cold air. Then the cabin door opened, and Sarah stepped out. "No!" Jacob said sharply, but she ignored him. She walked forward until she stood beside him, her head high, her jaw set in a determined line that reminded Jacob powerfully of her father. "Mr. Holloway," Sarah said, her voice clear and steady, "I will never marry you. Not if you hold a gun to my head. Not if you threaten Jacob. Not if you drag me back to Wyoming in chains. I would rather die in these mountains than spend one day as your wife." Holloway's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You broke my nose. You ran away and made me look like a fool. Do you have any idea what people are saying about me?" "I don't care what people are saying about you," Sarah replied. "I don't care about your pride or your reputation or your family's money. I care about living my life on my own terms, and those terms don't include you. Your uncle took my money. My uncle had no right to take your money or make any arrangements on my behalf. I have legal guardianship under my father's will. Any contract you think you have is worthless." Sarah pulled a folded paper from her pocket, a copy of the guardianship documents Eleanor had provided. "This is filed with the territorial court. You can ride to the county seat and check if you don't believe me." Holloway stared at the paper, his dreams of ownership crumbling before his eyes. Then his expression twisted into something ugly. "Fine," he said. "If I can't have you legally, there are other ways. Accidents happen in the mountains, don't they? People disappear and no one asks questions. Old hermits especially. No family, no one to miss them." Jacob felt ice slide down his spine. This was no longer about marriage or money. This was about a spoiled man's pride, and that made him far more dangerous. "Are you threatening us?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp. "I'm stating facts," Holloway replied. "These mountains are dangerous. Anything could happen. And without your protector here," he gestured at Jacob, "you'd be vulnerable. You'd need help. You'd need someone to turn to." "You're insane," Sarah said. "I'm determined," Holloway corrected. "And I always get what I want, eventually." He turned his horse. "We'll be back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. But we'll be watching, waiting for our moment. You can't stay alert forever, old man. Sooner or later you'll slip. And when you do—" He left the threat hanging as he and his men rode away, disappearing back into the tree line. Jacob and Sarah stood frozen, watching until the riders were out of sight. Then Jacob grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the cabin. "Inside, now!" Once they were behind the closed door, Jacob began pacing like a caged animal. "That was foolish, coming outside. I told you to stay hidden. I couldn't let you face them alone," Sarah protested. "He threatened us, Sarah. He as much as said he'd kill me to get to you. This isn't about marriage anymore. This is about something much worse." Sarah sank into a chair, the adrenaline leaving her shaky. "What do we do?" Jacob forced himself to think clearly despite the fear churning in his gut. "We can't stay here." Not if he meant what he said about coming back. "The cabin's defensible, but only if there's 2 of us. If something happened to me—" He couldn't finish the thought. "Nothing's going to happen to you," Sarah said firmly. "You can't know that. An ambush, a rifle shot from the trees, a dozen different ways a man could be killed if someone was determined enough." Jacob moved to the window, scanning the tree line. "We need to get you somewhere safe. Eleanor's boarding house in Pine Ridge, or even further if necessary." "I'm not leaving you," Sarah said. "Sarah, no." She stood, moving to face him. "I'm not running anymore, and I'm not leaving you alone to face this. We're in this together, remember? You promised you wouldn't run, and I'm making the same promise. We figure this out together, or not at all." Jacob wanted to argue, to insist she be reasonable, to protect her the only way he knew how, by getting her away from danger. But looking at her face, at the determination and courage there, he knew she wouldn't go. Thomas's daughter had inherited his stubbornness along with his strength. "Then we prepare," Jacob said finally. "We set up defenses, establish watch schedules, make this cabin as secure as possible. And we send word to Eleanor and Clayton, let them know what's happening. If Holloway tries anything, we'll need allies who know where we are and what we're facing." They spent the rest of the day fortifying the cabin. Jacob showed Sarah how to create barriers at the windows that could be quickly deployed, how to set up tripwires that would alert them to anyone approaching. They moved all their supplies inside, checked and rechecked their ammunition, prepared emergency packs in case they needed to flee quickly. As evening fell and they worked by firelight, Sarah asked the question that had been weighing on both of them. "What if he really does try to kill you?" "What if? Then you run," Jacob said firmly. "You take the roan, you follow the trail I showed you, and you ride like hell for Pine Ridge. Eleanor will protect you, and Clayton will make sure Holloway faces justice, and leave you dead in the snow." Sarah's voice broke. "I can't do that, Jacob, I won't." Jacob crossed to her, taking her face in his hands. "Listen to me. If something happens to me, you survive. You find a way to keep living, to build the life you deserve. You don't let my death be for nothing. Promise me, Sarah." Tears streamed down her face. "This isn't fair. I just found you. We just started to—" "She couldn't finish, I know," Jacob said, pulling her close. "But life isn't fair. We both know that. All we can do is fight with everything we have and hope it's enough." They held each other in the firelight, both terrified, both determined, both understanding that the peace they'd found was hanging by a thread. Holloway's visit had changed everything. He'd revealed himself not as a rejected suitor, but as something far more dangerous, a man whose pride mattered more than human life. That night, they took turns keeping watch. When it was Sarah's turn, she sat by the window with the rifle across her lap, staring out into the darkness. Somewhere in those mountains, James Holloway was planning his next move, and she and Jacob would have to be ready when he made it. Jacob, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, lay in his bed and thought about the silver wedding band he'd finally removed. He'd taken it off to signal he was ready to move forward, to open himself to new possibilities. Now he wondered if he'd done it too late, if he'd wasted too much time and would lose everything again before he'd fully appreciated what he'd found. No, he told himself firmly. He wouldn't think like that. He'd fought mountain lions and blizzards and bone-deep loneliness for 20 years. He could fight one spoiled rich man who thought money made him invincible. He had something Holloway didn't. He had the mountains on his side, and he had Sarah fighting beside him. Tomorrow they'd send a message to Eleanor, let her know about the threat. They'd prepare as best they could and wait. Because waiting was what Jacob Stone did best. Patient, alert, ready for whatever came. Holloway thought he was dealing with a broken old man hiding from the world. He was about to learn that the hermit had teeth, and that threatening what he loved was the fastest way to discover just how sharp those teeth could be. The mountains had taught Jacob to survive. Sarah had reminded him what survival was for, and together they'd face whatever came next with courage, determination, and the fierce protectiveness of people who'd finally found something worth fighting for. The day after Holloway's threat, Jacob made the journey down to Pine Ridge alone. Sarah had wanted to come, but he'd insisted she stay behind with the rifle and the barricaded cabin. He couldn't shake the feeling that separating them, even temporarily, was exactly what Holloway wanted, but he had no choice. Eleanor needed to know what they were facing, and messages sent by anyone else couldn't be trusted. He rode hard, pushing the bay-gelding Sam as fast as he dared on the icy trails. The whole time, his mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if Holloway's men doubled back to the cabin while he was gone? What if they were watching right now, waiting for exactly this opportunity? But when he reached Pine Ridge in record time, the settlement seemed quiet, almost peaceful. He went straight to Eleanor's boarding house, where he found her and Clayton Pierce sharing coffee in the dining room. Jacob, Eleanor said, reading his face immediately. "What's happened?" He told them everything. Holloway's visit, the threats, the clear implication that violence was being considered if Sarah couldn't be claimed peacefully. Clayton's expression darkened with anger, while Eleanor's showed deep concern. "That boy needs a hard lesson," Clayton muttered. "Thinks money gives him the right to threaten decent people. The problem is, he's not operating inside the law anymore," Jacob said. "He knows he has no legal claim, so he's fallen back on intimidation and implied violence. That makes him unpredictable, dangerous." Eleanor stood and went to her office, returning with the guardianship documents. "I've made multiple copies. I'm sending one to the territorial marshal's office, one to the county seat, and keeping one here. If anything happens to you or Sarah, there will be a clear legal record showing she's under my guardianship and that she chose to stay with you." "That won't stop a bullet," Jacob said grimly. "No," Eleanor agreed. "But it will ensure that anyone who fires that bullet hangs for it." Clayton leaned forward. "You need more than legal protection. You need practical help. I can round up 5 or 6 men, good men, who won't take kindly to some Wyoming rich boy threatening one of our own." "Sarah's only been here a few months," Jacob protested. "She's not one of your own." "The hell she isn't," Clayton said firmly. "She's under Eleanor's guardianship, which makes her part of this community. And you've been trading with us for 20 years. You might keep to yourself, but that doesn't mean we don't claim you as ours. If Holloway wants trouble, he'll get more than he bargained for." Jacob felt something warm and unexpected in his chest. Gratitude, belonging, the realization that even after 20 years of isolation, he wasn't actually alone. These people barely knew him, yet they were willing to stand with him. "I don't want anyone getting hurt on our account," Jacob said quietly. "Then we'll make sure no one does," Eleanor replied. "Starting with you and Sarah. Clayton's right, you need help. At minimum, you need someone else at that cabin, someone to watch your back." "I'll go," Clayton volunteered. "I'm too old for winter ranching anyway, and my boys can handle things without me for a while." Jacob wanted to refuse, to insist he could handle it alone. But pride was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when Sarah's safety hung in the balance. "I'd appreciate that," he said finally. They spent the next hour planning. Clayton would ride back with Jacob, well armed and ready to help defend the cabin if necessary. Eleanor would spread the word through the network of trappers and settlers that Holloway was persona non grata in the region. Any help he tried to hire locally would be refused. Any supplies he tried to buy would be denied. "We'll make this territory too inhospitable for him to operate," Eleanor said with grim satisfaction. "He'll either give up or make a mistake. Either way, we'll be ready." Jacob was preparing to leave when Ezra Hawkins hurried into the boarding house, his face flushed with urgency. "Jacob, there's something you need to know. 2 more men rode in this morning, asking about you and the girl. Said they were working for Holloway, offering $50 to anyone who could provide information about your routines, your defenses, when you were most vulnerable." Jacob's blood ran cold. "Did anyone talk?" "Dutch Miller," Ezra said with disgust. "Drunk as always. More than happy to sell out a neighbor for drinking money. He told them you usually check your trapline early morning, that the girl would be alone in the cabin for at least 2 hours. When was this?" Jacob demanded. "An hour ago." They rode out, heading north right after. Jacob was moving before Ezra finished speaking, Clayton right behind him. They hit the door running, mounting their horses and kicking them into a gallop despite the dangerous, icy conditions. Sarah was alone. Holloway's men knew she'd be alone, and they had at least an hour's head start. Jacob's mind raced as he rode, calculating times and distances. If the men had left an hour ago, and he'd been in town for nearly 2 hours, they could already be at the cabin. Sarah was capable, armed, and knew what to do in case of danger. But against multiple attackers, he pushed Sam harder, the horse responding despite the treacherous footing. Clayton kept pace beside him, both men leaning forward, urging every bit of speed from their mounts. The journey that had taken Jacob 2 hours that morning took barely 90 minutes on the return. But those 90 minutes felt like an eternity. each second stretching out as Jacob's imagination conjured worse and worse scenarios. When they finally reached the valley that held his cabin, Jacob slowed, gesturing for Clayton to do the same. They needed to approach carefully, assess the situation before charging in blindly. They tied the horses in a protected hollow a quarter-mile from the cabin and proceeded on foot, moving quietly through the snow-covered timber. Jacob's old cavalry training came back to him: how to move without sound, how to use terrain for cover, how to approach a potentially hostile situation. As they drew closer, Jacob saw smoke rising from the cabin's chimney, a good sign. If men had attacked, the fire might have been allowed to die, or the cabin might have been burned entirely. But smoke meant someone was tending the hearth. Then he saw them, 3 horses tied near the cabin, 3 sets of boot prints leading to the door. His heart hammered against his ribs. They were here. Inside with Sarah, Clayton touched his arm, pointing. One man was visible through the window, moving around inside. Jacob couldn't see Sarah. "We need to get closer," Jacob whispered. "See what we're dealing with before we make a move." They circled around, using the terrain Jacob knew so well. As they approached the back of the cabin near the woodpile, they could hear voices, male voices, aggressive and demanding. "Don't care what papers you got. Mr. Holloway wants you back in Wyoming, and that's where you're going. I'm not going anywhere with you." That was Sarah's voice, strong despite the fear that must be coursing through her. "We can do this easy or hard, miss. Your choice." Jacob caught Clayton's eye and gestured. He'd go through the front, Clayton through the back window. It was a risk, but they had surprise on their side. And surprise was often the deciding factor in a fight. He moved to the front corner of the cabin, checking his pistol. The cavalry pistol he'd cleaned and loaded for the first time in years. The rifle was still with Clayton, who was a better shot at distance. Jacob took 3 deep breaths, centering himself. Then he stepped around the corner and kicked the cabin door open. The scene inside froze like a tableau. 3 men stood in a rough triangle around Sarah, who had her back to the fireplace, holding a cast-iron pan like a weapon. Her face was defiant, her jaw set, but Jacob could see the fear in her eyes. All 3 men spun toward Jacob, hands moving toward their weapons. But Jacob already had his pistol leveled, and the sound of Clayton's rifle being cocked at the back window stopped everyone cold. "Don't," Jacob said quietly. "Don't even think about it." The lead man, stocky, with a scar across his cheek, froze with his hand halfway to his gun. "This ain't your business, old man. We're here on legitimate business. There's nothing legitimate about 3 armed men threatening a woman in her own home," Jacob replied. His voice was calm, but his hands were steady on the pistol and his eyes were cold. "Now you're going to back away from the lady, real slow, and you're going to ride out of here. And if I ever see you on my property again, I won't be as accommodating. Holloway's paying us good money," one of the other men started. "Not enough to die for," Clayton's voice came from the window. "I got you all covered, and Jacob here was a cavalry scout. He can drop all 3 of you before you clear leather. You want to test that?" The scarred man looked at Jacob more carefully, seeing something in his eyes that made him reconsider. "We're just doing a job." "Then go find a different job," Jacob said. "This one's going to get you killed." A tense silence stretched out. Then slowly, the 3 men began backing toward the door, hands carefully visible. Jacob moved aside to let them pass, never lowering his pistol, never taking his eyes off them. As they mounted their horses, the scarred man looked back. "Holloway ain't going to like this. He'll just send more men." "Let him try," Jacob said. "Next time I won't be so polite." The men rode off, and Jacob watched until they disappeared into the tree line. Only then did he holster his pistol and turn to Sarah. She dropped the pan and ran to him, throwing her arms around him. "I thought they were going to take me." "I know," Jacob said, holding her tight. "I know. I'm sorry I left you alone." "That won't happen again." Clayton climbed in through the back window, rifle in hand. "That was close." "Too damn close," Jacob nodded grimly. "And it's not over." "He's right. Holloway will send more men, or he'll come himself with enough force that we can't turn them back." "Then what do we do?" Sarah asked, pulling back to look at him. Jacob moved to the table and sat down heavily, suddenly feeling every one of his 63 years. We can't keep playing defense. Every time we turn back his men, he just gets angrier, more determined. Eventually, he'll come with enough force or enough strategy that we won't be able to stop him. So we run, Sarah said. Disappear deeper into the mountains? Running's no good either, Clayton said. Winter's at its worst right now. Trying to relocate in these conditions could kill you both. And Holloway would just track you come spring anyway. Jacob thought about his old cavalry pistol, the weapon he'd thought he'd never need again. He thought about Margaret and Annie, about Thomas, about all the losses that had brought him to this mountain 20 years ago. He'd come here to hide from pain, to avoid the risk of caring about anyone ever again. But Sarah had changed that. She'd reminded him what it meant to have something worth protecting, worth fighting for. And sometimes the only way to truly protect something was to face the threat head-on, to end it decisively rather than constantly running or defending. There's another option, Jacob said slowly. We take the fight to him. Clayton raised his eyebrows. You want to go after Holloway? That's bold. It's necessary, Jacob said. He's in Willow Creek, 30 miles south. Probably in the best hotel they've got, living comfortable while he sends other men to do his dirty work. We ride there, we confront him publicly, and we make it clear, in front of witnesses, that any further action against Sarah will be met with immediate and overwhelming response. That's dangerous, Sarah said. He could have you arrested, claim you threatened him. He could try, Jacob agreed. But Eleanor's sending those guardianship papers to the territorial marshal. By now, they'll have reached the office in Willow Creek. We walk in there with legal documentation and community support, and we put Holloway on notice that he's the one breaking the law, not us. Clayton nodded slowly. It could work, especially if we bring enough men to make it clear he's not just dealing with a hermit and a girl. He's dealing with a community that won't tolerate his behavior. How many men can we gather? Jacob asked. By tomorrow? Maybe 8 or 10 if we spread the word tonight. Good men, all of them. Trappers, ranchers, prospectors. The kind who don't take kindly to rich boys, throwing their weight around. Clayton stood. I'll ride back to town now. Start gathering, folks. You and Sarah stay here, stay safe. Tomorrow morning, we ride south in force. After Clayton left, Jacob and Sarah barricaded the door and windows, then sat together by the fire. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving them both shaky and exhausted. I was so scared, Sarah admitted. When those men came, when I realized you weren't here, I didn't know if I'd ever see you again. You handled it perfectly, Jacob said, taking her hand. You stayed calm. You defended yourself. You didn't give them what they wanted. Thomas would have been proud. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. I keep thinking about how close it came. If you'd been even 10 minutes later, but I wasn't, Jacob interrupted gently. And tomorrow we're going to end this. We're going to face Holloway and make it clear that his threats won't work, his money won't work, and his men won't work. This is over. What if he doesn't listen? What if he's too proud to back down? Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Then we make him understand that his pride isn't worth his life. One way or another, this ends tomorrow. That night they didn't sleep. They kept watch in shifts, but even during the hours when they weren't officially watching, neither could truly rest. Too much adrenaline, too much fear, too much awareness that everything could change in an instant. As dawn approached, Jacob found himself standing at the window, watching the sky lighten from black to grey, to the pale blue of winter morning. Behind him, Sarah was checking their weapons, making sure everything was loaded and ready. Are you scared? She asked quietly. Terrified, Jacob admitted. But not of Holloway. I'm scared of losing you, of having found something precious and having it ripped away before I've had time to fully appreciate it. Sarah crossed to him, wrapping her arms around him from behind. Then we fight to keep it. We fight with everything we have. Jacob turned to face her, cupping her face in his hands. When this is over, if we survive this, there's something I want to ask you. Something important. Ask me now, Sarah said. No, Jacob replied. After, when Holloway's gone and we're safe, and we can think about the future without fear hanging over us. Then I'll ask, and hopefully you'll say yes." Sarah smiled through the tears that were forming in her eyes. "I'll say yes. Whatever you ask, the answer will be yes." They stood together as the sun rose, warming the frozen landscape with golden light. Somewhere to the south, James Holloway was waking up, probably planning his next move, probably still convinced his money and status would win out in the end. But he was wrong. He was dealing with people who'd survived loss and hardship and the cruel indifference of a harsh world. He was dealing with people who'd found something worth protecting and who wouldn't back down, wouldn't compromise, wouldn't surrender what they'd built together. By mid-morning, Clayton returned with 9 men. Jacob recognized most of them. Trappers he'd traded with over the years, ranchers from the lower valleys, even old Ezra Hawkins with a shotgun across his saddle. They were weathered, tough men who knew these mountains and understood what it meant to stand for your neighbors. "Ready?" Clayton asked. Jacob looked at Sarah, who nodded firmly. Then he looked at the men who'd come to stand with them, virtual strangers who were willing to risk themselves for what was right. "Ready," Jacob said. They mounted up and rode south toward Willow Creek, toward confrontation, toward an ending. The cavalry pistol rested heavy on Jacob's hip, a reminder of the man he'd been before grief had driven him into isolation. That man had known how to fight, how to lead, how to face danger head-on. It was time to remember those skills. It was time to stop running and start standing his ground. Because Sarah Whitmore was worth fighting for, and the life they were building together was worth protecting at any cost. The mountains watched them ride, silent and eternal, as they always had. And Jacob Stone, who'd hidden in those mountains for 20 years, was finally riding back into the world, not in retreat this time, but in defiance. Ready to face whatever came, ready to fight for what mattered, ready to prove that love and courage could overcome money and pride, and the kind of entitled arrogance that thought people could be owned. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation. Tomorrow would decide everything. But today, riding south with Sarah beside him and good men at his back, Jacob Stone felt something he hadn't felt in decades: hope. Willow Creek was larger than Pine Ridge. A proper town with brick buildings and a population that swelled during the summer months when prospectors came down from the high country to spend their findings. Now, in the dead winter, it was quieter but still substantial, perhaps 200 people, with a hotel, 2 saloons, a bank, and a marshal's office. Jacob's group rode in at midday, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air. People stopped to watch as 12 riders moved down the main street in a tight formation, not aggressive, but not friendly either. They looked like what they were, men with serious purpose. Clayton pointed to the Golden Eagle Hotel, the finest establishment in town. "Holloway's staying there." Took the best suite they had. They tied their horses outside the hotel and mounted the steps to the covered porch. Jacob paused at the door, looking back at his companions. "Let me do the talking. No one draws a weapon unless Holloway's men do first. This is about making our position clear, not starting a war." The men nodded their agreement. Jacob pushed open the door and stepped into the hotel's warmth. The lobby was decorated with velvet furniture and brass fixtures, far fancier than anything Jacob had seen in years. A clerk behind the desk looked up, his eyes widening at the sight of so many rough-looking men entering at once. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" the clerk asked nervously. "We're here to see James Holloway," Jacob said. "Which room?" I'm not sure I can give out that information." "Son," Clayton said, not unkindly, "we're not here to cause trouble. We're here to have a conversation. Now you can tell us which room, or we can knock on every door until we find him." "Your choice," the clerk swallowed. "Second floor, room 7. But Mr. Holloway has men with him. We're counting on it," Jacob said. They climbed the stairs, boots loud on the polished wood. Jacob's heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. This was it, the moment that would determine whether they lived in peace or spent the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. Room 7 was at the end of the hall. Jacob knocked firmly, 3 hard raps that echoed in the corridor. A voice from inside. "Who is it?" "Jacob Stone. We need to talk, Holloway." A pause, then the sound of multiple people moving inside. The door opened a crack, and one of Holloway's hired men peered out, the scarred man from the cabin. "You got some nerve showing up here," the man said. "Open the door," Jacob replied. "This ends now, one way or another." The door opened wider, and Jacob stepped inside, his companions following. The hotel room was large and well-appointed, with a sitting area and bedroom visible beyond. James Holloway sat in an upholstered chair by the window, dressed in expensive clothes, holding a glass of whiskey despite the early hour. 4 more hired men stood around the room, hands near their weapons. Holloway looked at Jacob and Sarah with an expression of contempt mixed with something else, maybe fear, though he was trying hard to hide it. "This is quite the show of force," Holloway said. "Afraid to face me alone?" "I'm not afraid of anything," Jacob replied. "But I wanted witnesses to this conversation. Men who will remember exactly what's said and who will testify to it if necessary." "Testify to what?" Holloway took a sip of his whiskey, trying to project calm control. Jacob pulled the guardianship papers from his coat and dropped them on the table between them. "To the fact that Sarah Whitmore is under legal guardianship, that any arrangement made by her uncle is null and void, that she's chosen to remain in Colorado of her own free will, and that any further attempts to coerce, threaten or harm her will be met with both legal action and physical resistance." Holloway glanced at the papers, but didn't pick them up. "Legal documents can be challenged. Arrangements can be renegotiated. Not this one," Sarah said, stepping forward. "My father was very specific in his will. He didn't trust his brother, and he made sure I'd be protected if anything happened to him. Eleanor Brennan is my legal guardian, and she supports my decision to stay exactly where I am, with this old hermit." Holloway sneered. "Living in sin in the mountains? That's the life you're choosing over what I offered you?" "I'm not living in sin," Sarah said firmly. "I'm learning wilderness skills from a man my father trusted. And yes, I'm choosing that over being property to a man who thinks money gives him the right to own people." Holloway's face flushed with anger. He stood abruptly, his whiskey sloshing. "You broke my nose. You humiliated me. You made me look like a fool in front of everyone I know. And now you come here with your papers and your hired men, thinking that changes anything." "These aren't hired men," Jacob said quietly. "These are my neighbors. People who live in these mountains and don't take kindly to outsiders threatening their community. You've been asking around about us, trying to hire local men to do your dirty work. How's that going for you?" Holloway's expression darkened. "No one wants to work for me in this godforsaken territory. They all close ranks, protecting their own. Fine, I've got men coming from Wyoming, real men, not these backwoods mountain folk. They'll be here in a week, maybe less. And what will they do?" Clayton asked. "You planning to start a war over a woman who doesn't want you?" "I'm planning to take what's mine," Holloway said. "One way or another." Jacob took a step forward, his voice dropping to something cold and hard. "Sarah isn't yours. She never was and never will be. And if you send more men into those mountains, if you threaten her or me again, I'll kill you myself. Not your hired guns, you. I'll track you down wherever you run, and I'll put a bullet in you." "That's not a threat. That's a promise." The room went silent. Holloway's hired men tensed, but Jacob's companions were ready, hands near their weapons. The mathematical reality was clear. If shooting started, people on both sides would die. But Holloway would almost certainly be one of them. "You can't threaten me," Holloway said. But his voice lacked conviction now. "I just did," Jacob replied. "And every man in this room heard it. They also heard you admit you're planning to send armed men after a woman who's under legal protection. That's kidnapping, Holloway. That's a hanging offense in this territory. My family has lawyers. Your family's lawyers can't help you if you're dead," Clayton interjected. "And they can't change the fact that you're breaking the law. The Territorial Marshal's office has copies of the guardianship documents. They know Sarah's staying voluntarily. Any action you take against her is criminal." Holloway looked around the room, perhaps realizing for the first time that he'd miscalculated. He'd thought money and determination would be enough, that he could simply overwhelm a hermit and a girl. But he was facing something more powerful: community, determination, and people who had nothing to lose. "This isn't over," Holloway said. trying to salvage some dignity. "Yes, it is," Sarah said firmly. "I'm sorry your pride is wounded. I'm sorry you wasted your money on an arrangement that was never valid. But I don't owe you anything, not my presence, not my apology, and certainly not my life. Go back to Wyoming, Mr. Holloway. Find someone who actually wants to be with you. Leave us alone." For a moment, Holloway looked like he might say something else, might make one final threat, but then his shoulders sagged slightly, and Jacob saw what he'd suspected all along. Underneath the arrogance and entitlement was just a young man who'd been told no for the first time and didn't know how to handle it. "Get out," Holloway said quietly. "All of you, get out of my room." Jacob held his gaze for a long moment, making sure the message had been received and understood. Then he nodded to his companions and they filed out, leaving Holloway standing alone with his hired men in the expensive hotel room that suddenly felt more like a prison than luxury. In the hallway, Clayton let out a breath he'd been holding. "Well, that could have gone worse." "It's not finished," Jacob said. "He backed down today, but that doesn't mean he won't try again when his pride recovers." "Maybe," Clayton agreed. "But at least we made our position clear. And we have witnesses now." His own men heard him admit he was planning to send armed men after Sarah. "That's evidence if we need it." They descended the stairs and stepped out into the cold afternoon air. Jacob felt exhausted, the adrenaline draining away and leaving him hollow. But they weren't safe yet. Not until they were back in the mountains, back on familiar ground. As they moved toward their horses, a voice called out from across the street. "Mr. Stone? Miss Whitmore?" A man in a marshal's badge was approaching, older, weathered, with the cautious authority of someone who'd kept the peace in rough country for many years. "I'm Marshal Hendricks," the man said. "I received some documents from Eleanor Brennan regarding guardianship. Thought I should introduce myself, let you know I'm aware of the situation." "Appreciate that, Marshal," Jacob said. Hendricks glanced up at the hotel. "James Holloway's been making a nuisance of himself since he arrived. Making demands, throwing money around, expecting special treatment. I don't like men who think wealth puts them above the law." "Neither do we," Sarah said. "The documents Mrs. Brennan sent are in order," Hendricks continued. "Far as I'm concerned, you're exactly where you should be, doing exactly what you want to do. If Holloway or anyone else bothers you again, I want to know about it immediately." "Understood." Jacob nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Having the law on their side changed everything. "Understood. Thank you, Marshal. Don't thank me. Just doing my job." Hendricks touched his hat. "Safe travels back to the mountains." "Weather's turning bad again. Another storm coming in tomorrow by the look of those clouds." They mounted up and rode out of Willow Creek, the town falling away behind them as they headed north toward home. No one spoke much during the ride. They were all processing what had happened, what it meant, whether it was truly over or just the beginning of something worse. Sarah rode beside Jacob, occasionally catching his eye and sharing a small smile. They'd faced Holloway together, stood their ground, and emerged unbroken. That had to count for something. As they approached the pass that would take them back into the high country, Clayton pulled alongside Jacob. "You did good back there," the old rancher said. "Kept your head, made your point, didn't let it escalate into bloodshed. I learned a long time ago that the best fights are the ones you never have to have," Jacob replied. "But I meant what I said. If he comes after her again, I'll end him." "I know you will," Clayton said. "And so does he. That's why I think he'll back off. Men like Holloway are used to getting their way through intimidation and money. But when they meet someone who genuinely doesn't care about either, someone who will actually follow through on their threats, that scares them more than anything." Jacob hoped Clayton was right. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of James Holloway. Pride was a powerful motivator, and wounded pride even more so. They made camp that evening at the same grove where Jacob and Sarah had stopped on their journey to and from Pine Ridge. The other men set up their own camp nearby, giving Jacob and Sarah a measure of privacy while still providing security. Sarah sat close to the fire, staring into the flames. Jacob could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly, even though she tried to hide it. "It's not over, is it?" she asked quietly. Jacob wanted to lie, to tell her everything would be fine now, but he'd promised to be honest with her, always. "I don't know," he said. "Holloway backed down today, and we have the law on our side now. But men like him, they don't always think rationally. Pride can make people do foolish things, so we just wait? Wonder when he'll show up again." "No," Jacob said firmly. "We live. We build the life we want and we stay alert, but we don't let fear control us. That's what he wants, for us to live in constant anxiety, to give up what we've found because it's easier than fighting for it." Sarah leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "I'm tired of fighting," she admitted. "Tired of running, tired of being afraid. I just want peace." "I know," Jacob said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "And we'll have it. One way or another this will end, and we'll have the life we deserve." They sat together in the firelight, finding comfort in each other's presence, in the simple fact of not being alone. Tomorrow they'd return to the cabin, back to the routines they'd established. But something had changed today. They'd stopped reacting and started acting, stopped hiding and started standing firm. It was a beginning, Jacob thought. Not the end they'd hoped for, but a beginning of the ending. And sometimes that was all you could ask for. The courage to face what was coming, the strength to stand your ground, and the love of someone who'd stand there beside you no matter what came next. They returned to the cabin the next afternoon, the promised storm rolling in behind them. Clayton and the other men turned back at the pass, satisfied that Jacob and Sarah were as safe as they could be for now. But Clayton promised to check in regularly, and Jacob knew the network of mountain folk would be watching, alert for any sign of Holloway's return. The cabin felt like a sanctuary after the tension of Willow Creek. Sarah immediately set about making coffee and heating up stew while Jacob tended the horses and checked the perimeter. Everything was as they'd left it. No more boot prints, no signs of intrusion. That evening, they sat by the fire in comfortable silence. The storm outside was building, wind howling through the peaks, snow beginning to fall in earnest. They were sealed in for at least a few days, but that felt like a blessing rather than a trap. Time to rest, to recover, to simply be. "Do you think he'll really give up?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. Jacob had been thinking about that question all day. "Honestly, I don't know. We did everything right. We faced him publicly. We had witnesses. We showed him we weren't afraid. For some men, that would be enough. But Holloway," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "he strikes me as someone who's never had to accept defeat before. So what do? "We prepare for the worst and hope for the best," Jacob said. "We keep our weapons ready, we stay alert, and we trust that our friends will warn us if he makes another move. But we also live, Sarah. We don't let the possibility of danger stop us from building what we want here." Sarah moved closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "You said you wanted to ask me something. After all this was over." "It's not over yet," Jacob replied. "It might never be completely over," Sarah said. "There might always be something, some threat, some uncertainty. If we wait for perfect safety, we'll wait forever." Jacob pulled back to look at her. The firelight caught in her eyes, making them shine. She was right. There would never be a perfect moment, a time when all threats were resolved and the future was certain. Life didn't work that way. "Sarah Whitmore," Jacob said slowly, his heart pounding, "I'm 63 years old. I'm set in my ways, rough around the edges, and I've spent most of my adult life running from anything that looked like connection. I have no right to ask you this, and you'd be perfectly reasonable to say no." "Ask me anyway," Sarah said, smiling through tears that were beginning to form. "Will you marry me? Will you stay here in these mountains and build a life with me? I can't promise you ease or comfort or anything resembling what most people would call a normal life. But I can promise you honesty, loyalty, and love for as long as I'm breathing. I can promise you a partner who'll stand beside you through whatever comes. And I can promise you that every day with you is a day I'm grateful for. A day that proves life isn't over just because you've lived more of it than you have left to live." Sarah was crying openly now, but her smile was radiant. "Yes, yes to all of it. To the mountains, to the hard life, to you. 1,000 times, yes. Jacob pulled her close and kissed her, tender at first, then deeper, as 20 years of loneliness and grief fell away, replaced by hope and connection, and the simple miracle of being loved and loving in return. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, both grinning like fools. "When?" Sarah asked. "When can we—" A sound outside cut her off. Not the wind, something else. The crack of a branch, breaking under weight, the distinctive sound of someone trying to move quietly through snow and failing. Jacob was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. Sarah grabbed the rifle, her face suddenly pale. The moment of joy evaporated, replaced by the cold reality of danger. Through the window, Jacob could see movement in the tree line, multiple figures approaching from different directions. His heart sank. Holloway hadn't given up. He'd just been planning. "How many?" Sarah whispered. "At least 6 that I can see. Maybe more." Jacob moved to the door, checking the barricades they'd set up. "They're surrounding us," a voice called out from the darkness. Holloway's voice, but changed. Angrier, more desperate. "Stone, I gave you a chance to do this easy. You should have taken it." Jacob didn't respond. He was calculating angles, counting ammunition, trying to figure out how to defend against an attack from multiple directions. "I've got 8 men out here," Holloway continued. "All armed, all paid well enough to risk a fight. Send out Sarah and we'll leave. Otherwise, we're coming in." "Don't do it," Sarah said immediately. "Jacob, don't even think about it." "I won't," Jacob assured her. But his mind was racing. 8 armed men against 2. The odds were bad. The cabin was defensible, but only to a point. If they set fire to it, if they simply waited them out, "You've got 1 minute to decide." Holloway shouted. Jacob looked at Sarah, seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes. This was it. The moment they'd been dreading, the confrontation that would determine everything. "The cave," Jacob said suddenly. "The one I showed you, behind the waterfall. If we can make it there, they'll never find us. We can wait them out. How do we get there with 8 men surrounding the cabin?" Jacob moved to the back wall where he kept his emergency supplies. "There's a root cellar under the cabin, access through a trapdoor in the bedroom. It leads to a tunnel I dug years ago, just in case. Opens out about 50 yards into the woods, hidden by deadfall. We can use it to escape, make our way to the cave. Time's up, Stone." Holloway's voice was closer now. "We go now," Jacob said, grabbing their emergency packs. "Quiet as we can, fast as we dare. Once we're out, we don't stop running until we're at the cave." "Understood." Sarah nodded, her face set with determination. They moved to the bedroom, and Jacob pulled back the rug to reveal the trapdoor he'd constructed years ago. It opened onto darkness, a narrow tunnel barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. "You first," Jacob said. "I'll cover our exit. Make sure they don't realize we're gone until we're clear." Sarah hesitated. "Jacob, go," he said firmly. "I'll be right behind you." "I promise." She climbed down into the darkness, and Jacob could hear her moving through the tunnel. He grabbed the rifle, took one last look at the cabin, the home they'd built together over these few short months, and followed her down, pulling the trapdoor shut above him. The tunnel was cramped and cold, the earth pressing in from all sides. Jacob crawled forward, following the sound of Sarah's movement ahead of him. Behind them, he could hear shouting. Holloway's men were losing patience, getting ready to force their way in. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, though Jacob knew it was only about 60 feet. Finally, he saw Sarah silhouetted against the faint light of the exit, pushing aside the deadfall that concealed the opening. She emerged into the snowy forest, and Jacob followed moments later. They could hear the crash of the cabin door being broken down. Holloway's angry voice demanding to know where they were. "Run," Jacob whispered. And they did. The storm provided cover, snow falling so thick it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. They moved through the forest like ghosts, using every bit of wilderness knowledge Jacob had accumulated over 20 years. He knew these woods, knew every trail and creek and hidden path. Behind them, shouting erupted as Holloway's men realized the cabin was empty. Jacob heard orders being given, men spreading out to search. But in the storm, in the darkness, finding 2 people who knew the terrain would be nearly impossible. They reached the frozen waterfall after 20 minutes of hard running. Jacob led Sarah behind the curtain of ice into the cave beyond. It was freezing inside, their breath misting in clouds, but it was shelter and it was hidden. "They won't find us here," Jacob said quietly. "Even if they search all night, they won't think to look behind the waterfall." Sarah was shivering, whether from cold or fear or both. Jacob wrapped her in the emergency blanket from his pack and pulled her close, sharing body heat. "I'm sorry," he said. "I thought confronting him would end it. I didn't think he'd be crazy enough to—" "This isn't your fault," Sarah interrupted. "He's the one who can't accept no for an answer. He's the one who chose violence over reason." They huddled together in the darkness, listening to the storm rage outside. Jacob could hear distant sounds, men calling to each other, horses moving through the forest. But the sounds never came close to their hiding place. Hours passed. The cave grew colder as night deepened. Jacob kept Sarah wrapped tight against him, using his own body to shield her from the worst of the cold. His old cavalry training came back. How to stay warm in brutal conditions, how to conserve energy, how to wait patiently for the right moment to move. "Jacob," Sarah whispered, "what if they find the tunnel? What if they're waiting at the cabin when we go back?" "Then we don't go back," Jacob said. "We head to Pine Ridge, get help, come back with enough men that Holloway has no choice but to surrender. And if they burn the cabin while we're gone—" Jacob was quiet. The cabin held everything he'd built over 20 years, his tools, his supplies, his life. But looking at Sarah in his arms, he realized none of that mattered as much as he thought it did. "Then we rebuild," he said simply. "It's just wood and nails. What matters is that we're alive, that we're together. Everything else can be replaced." Sarah pulled back to look at him, her eyes shining even in the darkness. "You really mean that?" "I really do. 20 years ago, I came to these mountains thinking if I could just isolate myself enough, protect my heart enough, I'd never have to hurt again. But I was wrong. I wasn't protecting my heart. I was killing it slowly. You brought it back to life, Sarah. You showed me what I'd been missing. A cabin, possessions, even these mountains. None of it means anything if I don't have someone to share it with." "I love you," Sarah said softly. "I should have said it before, but I love you, Jacob Stone." "I love you too," Jacob replied, the words feeling both strange and natural. He hadn't said them to anyone since Margaret, hadn't thought he ever would again. "And when this is over, when we're safe, we're getting married. Not waiting for perfect timing or ideal circumstances. Just you and me and whoever we can find to perform the ceremony." "Eleanor?" Sarah said immediately. "She should be there. And Clayton, then that's what we'll do." Jacob pulled her close again. "But first we survive the night. Then we figure out how to end this." As dawn approached, the sounds of searching faded. Either Holloway's men had given up for the night, or they'd moved their search to a different area. Jacob waited until full daylight before suggesting they move. "We head to Pine Ridge," he said. "It's a hard day's travel in this weather, but we can make it. We get help, we get the marshal involved, and we end this properly, with the law on our side and enough force that Holloway can't fight back." They emerged from the cave into a world transformed by the storm. At least 2 feet of fresh snow covered everything, and the temperature had dropped brutally. But the sun was rising, painting the white landscape in shades of pink and gold. Jacob led Sarah through the forest, taking paths he'd used for years, routes that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. They moved steadily, conserving energy, staying alert for any sign of Holloway's men. By mid-morning, they'd put several miles between themselves and the cabin. Jacob's legs ached with the effort of breaking trail through deep snow, and he could see Sarah was struggling despite her determination. They stopped in a protected hollow to rest and eat some of the dried meat from the emergency pack. "How much farther?" Sarah asked. "Another 4 hours if the weather holds," Jacob replied. "We're making good time." A sound made them both freeze, voices not close but closer than Jacob liked. He gestured for silence, and they crouched low, hidden by the terrain and snow-covered brush. 2 of Holloway's men appeared, following a path that would take them within 50 yards of Jacob and Sarah's position. They were talking, their voices carrying in the cold air. Waste of time. They could be anywhere by now. Holloway's paying us to search, so we search. But you're right, they're probably halfway to the next territory. Hope so. This cold's going to kill somebody if we stay out here much longer. The men passed by without seeing them. Jacob waited until their voices faded completely before standing. We need to move faster, he said. If they're still searching this far out, Holloway's serious about finding us. They pushed on, moving as quickly as the deep snow allowed. The sun climbed higher, providing minimal warmth but at least decent visibility. Jacob navigated by landmarks he'd memorized over the years, a distinctive rock formation, a lightning-struck pine, a frozen creek that bent in a particular way. By mid-afternoon, they spotted Pine Ridge in the valley below. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Jacob had never been so grateful to see that small settlement. They were almost safe, almost home. They descended the final slope and entered the town, drawing curious looks from the few people brave enough to be outside in the bitter cold. Jacob headed straight for Eleanor's boarding house, where they burst through the door in a cloud of snow and cold air. Eleanor looked up from her mending, her eyes widening. "Jacob, Sarah, what on earth?" Then she saw their faces, read the situation immediately. "Clayton," she called, "get in here now." Within minutes, they were seated by Eleanor's fire, wrapped in blankets, hot coffee in their hands. Jacob told the story quickly. Holloway's attack, their escape, the night in the cave, the continued search. Clayton's face darkened with fury. "That boy's gone too far. You attacking someone's home, hunting them through the mountains in winter, that's attempted murder, plain and simple. We need to get the marshal," Eleanor said. "He needs to arrest Holloway before someone gets killed." "Agreed," Jacob said. "But we also need to secure the cabin. Make sure Holloway can't destroy it or use it against us somehow." "I'll round up the men," Clayton said, standing. "We ride out within the hour, arrest Holloway and his men, and make sure they face justice. This ends today." Jacob felt relief wash over him. They weren't alone in this. They had friends, allies, a community that wouldn't stand by while one of their own was threatened. Maybe finally this really would end. Maybe they could start building the life they'd promised each other. 3 months later, early spring came to the Colorado high country. The snow was melting slowly, revealing the green underneath. New grass pushing through the softening earth, wildflowers beginning to bloom in protected hollows, the aspens showing the first hints of leaf buds. The world was waking up after a long, hard winter. Jacob Stone stood on the porch of his cabin, their cabin now, watching Sarah tend the garden plot they'd prepared. She was planting seeds Eleanor had given her, working the soil with patient care, humming softly to herself. The cabin looked different than it had before Holloway's attack. Better, somehow. They'd repaired the damage together, but in doing so, they'd also added improvements, a larger window to let in more light, a proper sleeping loft, a covered porch that would provide shade in summer. It was becoming less of a hermit's shelter and more of a home. After the confrontation in Willow Creek, Marshal Hendricks had arrested James Holloway and his hired men. The charges were serious: attempted kidnapping, breaking and entering, assault with deadly weapons. With testimony from Jacob, Sarah, and half a dozen witnesses, the case had been straightforward. Holloway's father had sent lawyers, of course, expensive men from the city who tried to paint their client as a lovesick young man driven to extremes by emotion. But the judge hadn't been impressed. He'd sentenced Holloway to 5 years in territorial prison, with the understanding that any further contact with Sarah Whitmore would result in additional charges. The hired men had received lesser sentences, and most had already been released. But they'd left the territory immediately, clearly having no desire to face Jacob Stone or his friends again. The day after Holloway's sentencing, Jacob and Sarah had married. Eleanor had organized everything, a ceremony in the small church in Pine Ridge, with Clayton standing as Jacob's witness and Eleanor as Sarah's. The entire community had attended, filling the tiny building with warmth and goodwill. Jacob remembered standing at the altar, seeing Sarah walk toward him in the simple white dress Eleanor had helped her make. She'd been beautiful, not just in appearance, but in the joy radiating from her face, in the certainty of her steps, in the way her eyes never left his. The vows had been traditional, but Jacob had added his own words. "Sarah, you came to my mountain looking for survival skills, but you gave me something more precious. You gave me back my life. You showed me that it's never too late to start over, never too late to love again, never too late to choose hope over fear. I promise to honor that gift every day we have together." Sarah had cried through her own vows, promising to stand beside him through whatever came, to build a life together in these mountains they both loved, to never let fear or judgment or the opinions of others diminish what they'd found. Now, 3 months later, they'd settled into a rhythm that felt natural and right. Mornings checking traps together, afternoons working on the cabin and garden, preparing for the summer ahead. Evenings by the fire, talking or reading or simply sitting in comfortable silence. Sarah had proven herself more than capable of mountain life. She could shoot as well as Jacob now, could read weather signs and animal tracks, could navigate the high country with confidence. But she'd also brought something Jacob had been missing: laughter, lightness, the ability to find joy in small moments. Just yesterday, she'd surprised him by making a cake from ingredients she'd been hoarding, surprising him for his 64th birthday. It had been lopsided and slightly burned on one side, but it was the most delicious thing Jacob had ever tasted, because it had been made with love. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah called from the garden. "You," Jacob replied honestly. "Us. How different life is now compared to a year ago." Sarah stood and walked to the porch, wiping dirt from her hands. She was showing now, just slightly, a gentle curve to her belly that would be obvious to anyone who knew to look. They'd discovered she was pregnant 2 weeks ago, and the news had left Jacob simultaneously terrified and overjoyed. At 64, he was going to be a father again. The thought should have been impossible, laughable even. But looking at Sarah, at the life growing inside her, Jacob felt only gratitude. "Scared?" Sarah asked, reading his expression. "Terrified," Jacob admitted. "I'm old enough to be a grandfather to this child. I might not live to see them grow up fully. I don't know if I remember how to be a father." Sarah took his hands. "You'll be wonderful. And yes, you're older than most new fathers. But you're also wiser, more patient, more experienced. This child will be so lucky to have you. What if something happens? What if—" Jacob couldn't finish. The memory of losing Annie and Margaret was still sharp, even after all these years. "Then we'll face it together," Sarah said firmly. "But Jacob, we can't live in fear of what might happen. We have to trust that this is meant to be, that we'll handle whatever comes." She placed his hand on her belly. "This child is already loved. That's what matters." Jacob felt moisture in his eyes. At his age, he'd thought all the tears were long dried up. But Sarah had changed that too, had shown him it was okay to feel deeply, to be vulnerable, to let emotions show. "Your father would have been proud," Jacob said quietly. "Seeing you strong and happy, and building the life you chose for yourself. He would have loved you," Sarah replied. "He always did, really." And he would have loved this, knowing that his daughter and his mentor found each other, that something good came from all the hardship. They stood together on the porch, watching the mountains wake from winter's sleep. In a few weeks, the passes would be fully clear, and travelers would begin moving through again. Eleanor and Clayton had promised to visit, bringing supplies and news from the wider world. But for now, it was just the two of them, and soon, 3, in this small valley at the top of the world. Jacob had spent 20 years in these mountains, believing his story was over, that the best he could hope for was peaceful solitude until death came to claim him. He'd been wrong about so much. His story hadn't been over. It had just been waiting for the right person to help him. Write the next chapter. Sarah had ridden 300 miles through dangerous country on the word of a dying father and a wooden horse carved long ago. She'd found a broken hermit who'd forgotten how to live, and she'd, patiently, stubbornly reminded him that life wasn't just about surviving. It was about connection, about purpose, about having someone to share the journey with. On Jacob's workbench inside, visible through the window, sat a new wooden horse. This one was smaller, more delicate, carved with all the skill he'd accumulated over the years. It was unfinished. He added a little more detail each evening, letting the work unfold slowly, naturally. It was for the baby, for the future, for the life that was still being written. "Come inside," Sarah said, tugging his hand. "I want to show you something." Inside the cabin, warm from the fire and smelling of fresh bread, Sarah pulled out a letter she'd been writing. It was addressed to Eleanor, detailing their plans for the summer, asking advice about the baby, sharing small observations about mountain life. "I want to start writing things down," Sarah explained. "Our story, the things we've learned, the life we're building. So someday, when this child is old enough to understand, they'll know how we found each other. They'll know that love can come at any time, at any age, and that the best things in life are often the ones you never planned for." Jacob pulled her close, marveling at the warmth of her, the solid reality of her presence. "Tell them their father was a stubborn old hermit who thought he was done with living. Tell them their mother was the bravest person he ever knew, brave enough to chase hope across 300 miles of wilderness. And tell them that love doesn't have an expiration date, that opening your heart, even after years of protecting it, is the most courageous thing a person can do." Sarah smiled up at him. "I'll tell them all of that. And I'll tell them that in these Colorado mountains, two people who'd been running from different kinds of pain finally stopped running and started building. That they chose each other, chose this life, and never regretted it for a moment, not even when I'm grumpy about the weather or when I track snow inside or when I forget to say what I'm feeling," Jacob asked with a slight smile. "Not even then," Sarah confirmed. "Because even on hard days, even when things aren't perfect, I'd rather be here with you than anywhere else in the world." Outside, spring continued its slow transformation of the landscape. Ice melted, creeks began to flow again, animals emerged from hibernation. The world was renewing itself as it did every year, a cycle of endings and beginnings, death and rebirth, winter and spring. Jacob Stone had learned that human hearts followed the same pattern. They could freeze, shut down, retreat from the world. But they could also thaw, open up, reach out toward connection again. It was never too late. There was no age limit on hope. No expiration date on the possibility of happiness. Sometimes, he thought as he held Sarah close, the best parts of life came when you least expected them. When you'd given up on hoping for more, when you'd convinced yourself the story was finished. That's when hope found you anyway. Riding through a snowstorm, carrying a wooden horse, refusing to take no for an answer. In those Colorado mountains, Jacob Stone had learned what it meant to truly live again. And every morning when he woke up beside Sarah, every evening when they sat together watching the sunset paint the peaks in gold and purple, every moment of their ordinary, extraordinary life together, he was grateful, grateful for second chances, grateful for courage, both his and hers, grateful for community, for friends who'd stood by them when they needed it most, grateful for love that had no concern for age or convention or what other people thought. Grateful simply to be alive, to be loved, to have found his way home after 20 years of wandering in the wilderness. The wooden horse sat on the workbench, slowly taking shape. Jacob would finish it eventually, give it to the child who was coming, and tell them the story of how their parents met. He'd tell them about Thomas Whitmore, the boy who'd believed in a broken man when he couldn't believe in himself. He'd tell them about perseverance and courage and never giving up on the people you love. But mostly, he'd tell them about hope, how it finds you when you need it most, how it transforms everything, how it proves that no matter how long the winter, spring always comes eventually, and in that small cabin at 9,000 feet, surrounded by peaks that had witnessed human joy and sorrow for millennia. Two people who'd thought their best years were behind them discovered something precious. Love doesn't care about perfect timing or ideal circumstances. It just is. And when you find it, you hold on to it with everything you have. Jacob and Sarah had found it. Against all odds, through hardship and danger, past fear and doubt, they'd found it. And they would protect it, nurture it, let it grow alongside the child that was coming and the life they were building. Together, the story that had started with a wooden horse and a dying man's last words had become something beautiful, a testament to resilience, to second chances, to the stubborn insistence that it's never too late to start over. And as the sun set over the Colorado high country that evening, painting the world in shades of fire and gold, Jacob Stone stood on his porch with his wife beside him, his hand on her belly where new life was growing, and thought, this is what happiness looks like. Not perfect, not easy, but real and earned and worth every struggle it took to find it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a baby to prepare for, a garden to maintain, traps to check, a life to continue building. But tonight there was just this, peace, love, and the certain knowledge that he was exactly where he was meant to be, with exactly the person he was meant to be with, and that, Jacob thought as Sarah leaned into him and they watched the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky, was everything.